And I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. And I declare open the public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters for its inquiry into the Referendum Amendment Bill. In accordance with the committee's resolution of 3 August 2022, this hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. I remind members of the media who may be present or listening on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. I note that some witnesses will be joining in person and some remotely at later stages today, so I encourage anyone participating by video conference or teleconference to ensure they're clearly identified to the committee and to anyone else listening to proceedings. And I now call on representatives from the Department of Finance to give evidence. For the Hansard record, can you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Thank you, Chair. Nathan Williamson, Deputy Secretary, Department of Finance.
And Sebastian Powney, Assistant Secretary, Department of Finance.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Do you have an opening statement you want to make, or we'll just go to discussion?
No, thanks, Chair. Happy to go to questions.
Great, excellent. Perhaps if we could start, you talked in your submission about the bill improving transparency and integrity measures for referendums. Can you go to how it operates to do that and how it updates the process of referendums to bring it into line with how we currently vote in federal elections, please?
Thank you, Chair. The Referendum Machinery Provisions Act 1984 has not been used since 1999 and hasn't kept pace with amendments to the Commonwealth Electoral Act 1918. The bill amends the Referendum Act to ensure consistency between the two acts. This supports a modern referendum process that's consistent with the public's experience of federal elections, including integrity and transparency measures. As an example of some of the many technical alignments in the bill that align the bill with the Electoral Act, for example, streamlining postal voting applications, which means voters can apply online rather than using a paper form, enabling vote-saving measures, enabling early sorting of ordinary pre-poll votes from 4 p.m. on voting day, and implementing the same measures that exist in the Electoral Act to prevent multiple voting by known multiple voters. The bill also introduces a financial disclosure framework for referendums to support transparency and accountability. This replicates the same financial disclosure obligations in the Electoral Act that apply to candidates, and including the same disclosure threshold, which is currently $15,200. This framework will require those involved in referendum campaigning, referred to as referendum entities, to disclose how much they spend and receive on campaigning above this threshold. The bill also restricts foreign influence in referendums by applying the same ban on foreign donations and foreign campaigners that apply during federal elections.
Thank you. Many of the submissions the committee has received go to changes to Section 11 in the bill, and particularly the yes-no pamphlet. Can you update us on the provisions there? And also the intention of the government to inform the public about the referendum in a fair and equitable way if that pamphlet is not there?
Thank you, Chair. So the bill temporarily lifts a funding restriction that's contained in Section 11.4 of the Referendum Act to enable funding of educational initiatives. The restriction of government funding under Section 11.4 was introduced into the referendum framework first in 1984. This approach to temporarily suspend this subsection is consistent with the approach taken in the 1999 referendum and the proposed 2013 referendum. The government has stated in a recent media release on the 1st of December that it does not intend to fund either a yes or no campaign, and that the temporary suspension of these expenditure restrictions in Section 11 of the Referendum Act is designed to ensure the government can provide Australians with factual information about the referendum. And this was also referred to by Assistant Minister Gorman in his second reading speech when he introduced the bill.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Chair, noting time, I'll go across to you for questions.
Cool. Yes, thank you. When was the department asked to develop policy options for amendments to the Referendum Machinery Act?
Senator, we can go back and I don't have the exact date, but not long after the election of the government, we began work on looking at updating the Referendum Act to bring it into line with the Electoral Act.
Well, perhaps on notice you could find out the exact date. Who asked you to develop the policy options?
So it was probably, again, sort of in combination. It was obviously a stated policy of the government to proceed with the voice. So we were doing work in response to a stated policy, and then we had ongoing discussions from our side with the Special Minister of State in his office, and we've also been having conversations with other relevant departments.
Could you list the other departments?
So the Attorney General's Department, NIAA, PM&C,
They're the main.
and obviously within our own portfolio, we've been having discussions with the Australian Electoral Commission, who ultimately are responsible for delivering the referendum on the day and in the lead up.
But someone would have asked you to undertake this work, and I take your answer that you were doing some work based on the government's position, but I want to know who instructed you to undertake this work.
I'd have to take that on notice, Senator.
Okay. So are you aware, did this decision stem from a decision of Cabinet or of a subcommittee of Cabinet?
The matter has been considered by Cabinet, but I can't go any further into it than that.
Do you know on what date?
No.
On notice, could you advise on what date?
Yes, I'll take that question on notice.
And just to clarify, the work that you've undertaken did stem from a request from the Special Minister of State?
No, I would have to go back. I wouldn't want to mislead the committee. I would have to go back and look exactly how it unfolded. But as I said, the government had a very clear policy position on this, and so on their election, we begin working on all election commitments, including this particular election commitment, where we have a direct responsibility for the machinery of the referendum. And we've then had ongoing conversations. So I would say it'd be very difficult to say on this date at this time this person commissioned this work, because it's been a rolling
but there would have
conversations.
been a brief of some form that the minister would have signed off on, authorising the work to be undertaken.
There are many briefings on this matter.
But there would have been a formal brief, though. I'm not asking you to go specifically into the details of the brief. I'm saying there would have been a brief in relation to this. There would have been a decision of the minister. That's correct?
There have been many formal briefs on this matter.
Okay. Well, on notice, can you list the dates of those briefs?
I'll take that on notice.
And can you, as per before, confirm from which ministers? Did the Prime Minister give his approval for this process?
It's a matter that's being considered by the Cabinet, and I can't go into Cabinet deliberations.
When was the department first tasked with undertaking the drafting of this legislation?
I need to take that on notice.
And can you state by whom tasked you to undertake the drafting of the legislation? And did it stem from a decision of Cabinet or a subcommittee of Cabinet?
I'll take that matter on notice.
And on what date? And just to clarify, in terms of the drafting of the legislation, if it did come from a minister's office, if you could state on which date and which minister, and whether the request came through following approval from the Prime Minister. If you could take those on notice, please. On what date did the department consult with the Australian Electoral Commission?
So we've had ongoing conversations with the Australian Electoral Commission. I would say we nearly talk to them daily about these sorts of matters. So there's not one point in time where it's this is the conversation, this is the consultation, and now we've developed a bill. That's the whole point of the consultation. We're speaking to them regularly.
So when would you first consulted with the Australian Electoral Commission?
I'd have to take that on notice again, Senator, but it would have been many months ago.
Was the Minister's office, the Special Minister, was any Minister's office involved in that consultation?
So we have, as I said, probably nearly daily, but certainly weekly contact with the Australian Electoral Commission. Sometimes we would have meetings that would involve ministers or their officers, but not all the time.
On notice, can you list those dates of those meetings and also the attendees at those meetings?
Can I just clarify which meetings you're referring to there? Only the ones that involve...
The meetings you just referred to in your previous answer.
So all of our meetings with the Australian Electoral Commission?
In relation to this particular issue, and also where ministers' offices were in attendance.
Okay. Just to, I guess, provide context to the committee, we could have dozens of conversations in a day over the phone with the Australian Electoral Commission about this. So
I'm asking for about meetings, not telephone conversations. My questions were about meetings, following on from my questions about when you first consulted with the AEC, which you've taken on notice. Yeah.
Yes, I'm just trying to indicate there will be many meetings.
Just noting that it's not unusual to have meetings about preparing legislation. Is there a scope you want to give that helps with the timeliness and the department responding to that?
Well, it's to do with, it's pretty clear, it's to do with the proposed changes to the legislation. Was the Prime Minister's office involved in the consultation?
I think that's a question best directed to PMC.
No, it's directed to you in terms of my first question.
So I've had no conversation with the Prime Minister's office about this legislation.
Okay. Does this proposed legislation reflect the AEC's original feedback?
Again, that's very difficult because the drafting of the legislation is an iterative process. It wasn't a case of we or anyone went to the AEC and said, here is the draft legislation, give us your feedback. We are drafting that legislation, as I said, in an iterative process, talking to the AEC. So I know the AEC is on next. You could ask them whether they believe it incorporates their feedback. But from our point of view, it's been a very cooperative process working with the AEC. And as I said, we have literally dozens of conversations with them. As an independent officer, the Australian Electoral Commission has the opportunity to provide advice, obviously directly to government as well. So it's not a case of their advice comes through finance. They are also able to provide their advice directly to government.
So you will have accepted feedback from the AEC?
Certainly.
Is the department aware of any bodies or organisations who have been established with the sole purpose of organising electoral activities for the referendum?
Not off the top of my head, but I'll take that on notice.
Okay. Well, if you take it on notice, and I suppose the next question is, well, it's clear that in the public domain that some bodies have been established or are being established for the upcoming referendum, would you agree that bodies, organisations established for either the yes or no case for the referendum have little purpose beyond the referendum polling day?
I mean, you're asking me for an opinion there, but I would say it would depend on the construct of the organisation and what their mandate was. So I don't think I can go any further than that.
Can I just go back to your previous answer in relation to the involvement of the Prime Minister's office in relation to consultation? Just to clarify, you said that you'd had no conversations with the Prime Minister's office.
Correct.
Has anyone in the department had conversations?
I believe the Prime Minister's office have been involved in some of those broader discussions that have occurred between departments and the government.
So the Prime Minister's office has had conversations and meetings with.
So there have been, as I said, I mean, there's been a number of discussions, meetings along the way. Ministerial officers have been involved in some of those discussions.
Well, if you could list the dates on when those meetings took place with either the minister's offices, and I say ministers, not apostrophe S apostrophe, and the Prime Minister's office, and the attendees, that would be, if you take that on notice, please.
Yes.
Has the department undertaken, or is the department aware of any polling or community research in regards to the proposed referendum?
The department does not undertake polling or research in regard to the referendum, and I don't think we undertake polling or research, full stop.
Are you aware of any, is the department aware of any polling or community research in relation to the proposed referendum?
So certainly, well, I've seen in media there's been polling research out there. So yes, there is some that's taken place, but none that's within the remit of the Department of Finance.
Is the department aware of any polling or research that's been undertaken by the government?
I'm not. I'll take that on notice, sorry, because if it's been undertaken, as I said, it has not been undertaken by the Department of Finance, and I don't want to speak for others, so I'll take that question on notice to determine.
Deputy Chair, I don't want to cut you too short, but I do have a number of members asking for questions, so if I can put you on notice that I'm going to cut you off soon.
Okay, the opposition have quite a lot of questions in this area. If needs be, we might need to have another hearing if that's the case to ensure that our questions are all put. So in relation to the research, you've said that the department hasn't undertaken any research, and you're going to take on notice in relation to whether other departments have undertaken polling or research. If you could...
So, sorry to cut you off. So, for example, we would speak to NIAA because I'm not exactly sure what they've done, but they may have done something. That's what I mean.
If you could take on notice what research the department is aware of, and by which agency, and if copies of that research have been supplied to the department, to table a copy of that research before the committee.
Okay. Sorry, yes.
Now, I have a number of more questions, so I'm just looking at the chair in terms of how you want to handle this.
Well, how about we go through some other members, and if we have time, we'll come back to you.
So just would let you know then that the opposition have lots of questions for the department, and if we don't get through our questions today, I think we'll need to have a second hearing.
Well, I look forward to seeing you in January then, Deputy Chair.
It's okay. I look forward to it.
Indeed. All right, Senator Waters, are you online and did you have questions?
Hi there, Chair. Yes, hopefully the audio is working okay. Thank you, and thanks to the folks there for appearing. I'm sorry I can't see you in person. I'm not sure what your names are, but appreciate your time. A number of submitters have called for truth in advertising reforms to be in place prior to the next referendum, and that becomes arguably more important with the removal of the yes/no pamphlet and instead a reliance on public campaigns. Has the department been asked to consider provisions in relation to misleading claims in referendum materials, and what mechanisms are available to deal with any misleading claims that are made in referendum materials?
So it's Nathan Williamson from the department, Senator. The purpose of this bill is to bring the Referendum Act into alignment with the Electoral Act. In terms of your question around truth in advertising, JSCM is looking more broadly, as they always do, at the last federal election, and that issue is part of JSCM's remit for that review. And of course, we would wait to see the outcome of that particular inquiry.
Well, thanks, Mr. Williams. I am a permanent member of JSCM, so I'm certainly across what the committee is doing, but my question goes to the veracity of materials that will be produced by all sorts of people who will want to be involved in the public debate for the coming referenda. What are the provisions that are currently available to government to deal with any misleading that might, particularly since there won't be any form of sort of impartial, neutral pamphlet to outline to people the pros and cons?
Senator Sebastian Powney from Department of Finance. The Referendum Act contains various provisions that aim to promote free and informed voting at referendums, including allowing voters to know who is communicating referendum matter through authorisation laws, making persons participating in public debate relating to referendum matter responsible for their communications, and ensuring that obligations imposed by the Referendum Act in relation to communications can be enforced. This includes, for example, the offence of misleading of voters in relation to casting of a vote.
Thank you. So that's the existing provision, or rather, I assume it's the existing laws which go to how to vote as opposed to the effect of your vote. So again, I'm just trying to seek an understanding, are there any provisions at the moment that exist that would allow government or anybody to intervene where there's some misleading material that was produced? And if not, which I fear is the answer, what can be done when it happens?
Senator, as my colleague mentioned, the purpose of this bill is to align the Referendum Act with the same provisions in the Electoral Act. So the same safeguards apply. With respect to misleading voters in relation to the casting of a vote, as you'd know, that's a criminal offence with a penalty of 3 years imprisonment. And matters that contravene that section are referred to the AFP for enforcement. It is quite narrowly defined as to misleading of the casting of a vote, going to the process itself rather than broader mis and disinformation. For federal electoral events, which include a referendum, the Electoral Integrity Assurance Task Force is stood up, which works closely with digital platforms to assist in combating mis and disinformation. For example, for the 2022 federal election, the EIAT established escalation processes for the referral of content in breach of Commonwealth legislation or online platform terms of service. These online platforms also assisted the task force in combating the online dissemination of disinformation and misinformation regarding the electoral process.
Okay, thank you. So has the department been asked to consider either its existing powers or any proposed provisions in relation to truth in that pertains to the referendum? Have you been asked to work on this issue prior to the referenda?
So we haven't been asked to work on anything over and above what is currently in the bill, but having said that, our discussions have also gone to JSCEM's review of the 2022 federal election and what may come of that.
Okay, so presumably the timing of the JSCEM report, is it envisaged that any reforms that may flow in relation to truth in advertising from the JSCEM report, is it envisaged that those would be in place prior to the referendum occurring?
That will be a matter for government.
Okay, have you been asked to advise on or consider the timeframes of that scenario?
We don't advise on the time frame for the referendum. That's not a Department of Finance role.
Okay, who does, out of interest, who does decide on that?
So, I mean, ultimately, obviously, the timing of the referendum is for the is a matter for government. The Attorney General's Department advise on the question and constitutional change.
Does that mean they also do the date?
I couldn't go to the advice that they may be asked to provide to government because that's a matter for them. All I can tell you is that the Department of Finance is not. We don't advise on the date for the referendum.
Okay. So sorry, but which department does advise on the date?
So I can't be categorical because ultimately the date of the referendum is a matter for government and government could seek views from anyone, but the Attorney General's Department is responsible for advising on constitutional matters, including the question. But, you know, other departments or other entities, for example, the Australian Electoral Commission could be asked for a view about timing.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I understand that obviously consultation will be sought, but I'm just trying to work out who's jurisdictionally responsible in relation to the date. I understand the government will make the decision, but which department? Is it Attorney General's department?
I think they would be the best starting point.
Okay, so not you. All right, great, thank you. Now, has the department been asked to consider any potential alternatives to preparing a yes/no pamphlet? Sample material that might be authorised by the AEC or kind of expert panel. Have you been asked to deliberate or advise on?
Sorry, Senator, you broke up at the start of your question and I missed it. Are you able to repeat that?
Yes, sorry, the Wi-Fi is terrible here. Was the department asked to consider any potential alternatives for preparing the content of a yes/no pamphlet?
Sorry, I'm just pausing for a second, Senator. So we haven't been asked to advise on the content of a pamphlet.
No, my question was whether you've been, there is not going to be a pamphlet, stand. My question was, were you asked to advise on any alternatives to provide information to people?
We provided a range of advice to government around the conduct of the referendum, but that would go to cabinet deliberations.
Okay, so given that the House inquiry in 2021 advised that the independent expert panel to advise a joint parliamentary committee on referendum questions, including the content of a potential pamphlet, was the department asked to consider this option in your drafting of the bill?
We weren't asked to advise on an independent panel.
Okay. Thank you. And then I do have a number of other questions, but I'll just construct one further because I know there's lots of others that have a question. The most recent budget allocated funds to assist AEC First Nations enrolment and voter turnout. Now, amendments to the Act to allow on-the-day enrolment and to extend the period for remote mobile polling on 12 days could have a significant impact on engagement and ability to participate. Was the department asked to consider amendments to achieve that objective?
The department, again, that's sort of goes to the nature of the advice we provide to government. We provided a range of of advice around the potential conduct of the referendum, and I don't think I can go into it any further than that, Senator.
Well, will there be provision to allow on the day enrolment and longer than 12 days of mobile remote polling?
That is not the position that the government's put forward in this bill.
Okay. Right, thank you. If there's time, Chair, I wouldn't mind a second round if possible.
Okay, thank you. Mr Newman.
Senator Waters has gazumped me on the truth and advertising questions, but I really only got one question, and that is, it's been 22 years since we've had a referendum in this country and 45 years since that we've had a successful referendum, which pretty much, in my calculations, is the biggest period since we've ever had a referendum. But you said in your submission that this bill sort of aligns the referendum with election day, with the holding of election, and you mentioned, Mr Williamson, again, that word aligned this morning in your evidence. What do you mean by that? And what, for the education of the public, what does it mean, for example, to vote in a referendum? Is it the case that it will be exactly the same as voting, say, in a federal election, or is it, what do you mean by that word align, which you've said in your submission, you've said again this morning?
Yeah. So Mr Powney, in his opening response to the first question, talked about some things like postal votes and how people can go about registering for postal votes. A number of other matters he can take you through, if you like. And then the Australian Electoral Commission obviously is responsible for the referendum on the day, and they can talk to you about that experience. But essentially what it's trying to do is, to the extent possible, replicate the experience for somebody who has recently voted in a federal election. I mean, it could be the first time they vote, but the same experience on the day, or if it's not on the day, if they have to pre-poll, etc. They are largely the same arrangements.
So, Mr Powney, when you gave that evidence this morning, is it the department's intention and expectation that when you vote in this referendum on the voice, it will be the same process for the voter that would have happened at the last federal election in May this year?
Senator, that's essentially correct.
I'm a House of Representative member, not a Senator.
Excuse me. That's essentially correct. There may be some very minor differences, and I'm speaking of, obviously there's one ballot paper, not two, and sort of things like that. But I think perhaps the experience on voting day is perhaps best directed at the AEC, but that's certainly the intention, to have essentially the same experience for a voter to turn up to cast a vote.
So when you say the word aligns, it means it's the same as?
That's correct, and in fact it might assist the committee if I just mention that the bill itself is almost entirely a technical alignment with the Electoral Act. In fact, I can say Schedules 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 and 8 are entirely essentially technical alignments with the machinery of the Electoral Act to bring the two acts into, as far as we can get it, complete alignment in terms of the electoral machinery. That goes to things like postal voting, scrutiny, authorisations, designated electors, contingency measures. There's an entire schedule devoted to amending the references to ballot paper and ballot papers to give you a sense of the forensic approach that we've taken here. The two parts of the Act that I would just call out as not being that same kind of technical alignment are two things. One is Schedule 4 around financial disclosure. That's a new feature for the Referendum Act, obviously a very old feature for the Electoral Act. The Schedule 4 referendum financial disclosure provisions have been designed to align as absolutely as closely as possible with the financial disclosure arrangements for candidates in a federal election. But obviously there are some minor differences there in that the word, candidates don't exist in the referendum context, so we have a new concept of referendum entity. But with respect to the kind of the operational provisions, it's been aligned to the maximum extent possible. And the other area of the Act that I suppose is not a technical alignment with the Electoral Act are the referendum-specific provisions, particularly item 4, the disapplication of section 11, which is the part of the Referendum Act that goes to the pamphlet, as well as referendum communications, because that is unique to a referendum.
But for the experience of the voter, pre-poll, postal, on the day, it's the same.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Ms Cheney?
Thank you very much for that. My question, I only have one at this point, relates to the framing of the question in the referendum. And you've spoken about the intent of the bill being to modernise and align with the Electoral Act, and efforts are made to make voting as simple as possible in elections. The Referendum Act requires ballot papers present the long title of the bill, followed by the question, do you approve this proposed alteration? Did the department consider proposing an amendment so that the question can be modernised and simplified, such as, do you support the establishment of a First Nations voice as provided in the bill, in the Act? And if not, why not?
So that's the department, as I've said previously, provided a range of advice to government around options, and the bill is the government's position for the machinery of a referendum. I can't go. That goes to cabinet deliberations. The nature of the advice that we would put forward.
So, but I suppose the department was interested in aligning as closely as possible with, the modernisations that have happened in other areas. Is that something that the department would consider is necessary, so it's easier for people to understand what they're actually voting for?
So it's not really for the department to just form a position on this. It's for the government of the day to form the position on it, and we provide the advice to them to allow them to form that position. And as I said, this advice goes to cabinet deliberations.
Okay. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Senator Cadell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Evening, gentlemen. Morning, gentlemen. You said prior evidence, and entirely understandable that you don't advise a date. That's another department. We went fishing for where that is. But I know point, I'm going to go probably 17 or 18 in your submission, means that the disclosure will be for actually 17, 6-month period prior to the issue of writ. Do you have a window? How are you advised of a window? Are you knowledgeable about a window or a date about when that will be?
No, because that's just factually the case of how it will work.
So what would happen if that is already prior to the bill in the past? What would happen in retrospect? So if someone's taken a donation of greater than 15.2 and 6 months is actually closer, once the bill passes, they've taken it prior.
Oh, so you're saying if the bill hasn't passed the Parliament?
Yeah.
The expenditure period will commence 6 months prior to the issue of the writ.
I understand, but we haven't got a date on the window. Let's make up dates, because if you guys have no knowledge of this, let's say it's July. Let's say this passes in February. 6 months could be before that. What happens then?
The referendum entities who are required to disclose will need to disclose from that.
Yep.
Well, they have 15 weeks past polling day to do the disclosure.
Yep.
So they are referring to things that have happened in the past. But the disclosure itself, the obligation occurs up to 15 weeks after polling day.
So then, going back on, you've got the foreign donations, and that's spent. Is that in kind as well as donations? In kind support, technology, advice, endorsements. Am I going to see a big basketball player next to a candidate in this?
I believe that's correct, Senator. Yes.
Okay, so it's both those things. What happens if that's already happened now before priming this legislation? If a foreign entity has given one of the authorised bodies funding or in-kind support already?
There would be a period in which the entity that had received the foreign donation would need to take appropriate action with that donation, which essentially means to divest themselves of it.
So retrospectively, if they've taken a donation and spent it, they would have to reimburse, get rid of it if they're going to take part in the referendum?
Correct.
Okay.
That's the same as applies to candidates.
Yeah, that's right. Now, Mr Newman and other people and yourselves talking about alignment, and we're seeing lots of alignment. My feeling is we're trying to make, in areas such as disclosure, postal votes, donations, foreign influence, as close to the current Election Act as possible. I think there's been some talking about fast-tracking what JSCAM's looking in 22, but we're keeping it with the current legislation. But I note in the legislation currently, where this differs, is in an election there is public funding, is there not, for candidates and participants, and in the referendum there will not be. And that's correct, there's not?
Correct.
And in an election, there is voter information sent out by AUC and the government, is that correct?
On the process of voting? Yes, I understand that AC does.
Will that be the same? Will that be out there now?
That's my understanding, Senator, from the Act, but you probably have to ask the AC
They're coming
more
in next.
specific question. Yep.
Okay, so going to, I think, Professor, getting the right submission here, Professor George Williams' submission. Talks about part of the bill will suspend section 11/4. And so this is under Commonwealth expenditure. And he's noting that this may be, and I'll read from him, Act 14 to permit Commonwealth Fund civics education provide factual information to the community about the upcoming referendum. While it is not clear the suspension of section 11 is necessary for this, it is a prudent move given the level of doubt. However, the suspension of this clause raises further issues. So we're talking about removing section 11. That is a slight endorsement there. But the next paragraph, the next two paragraphs go on to say that if you remove that and these civic lessons go out, these civic education, oh, sorry if you haven't got that.
Yeah, sorry, we don't have the benefit of these
sorry,
submissions,
sorry.
it's a bit hard for us to...
Right.
We'll do our best.
Okay, well, I'll give you the general question on this. There's an odd way of going, if the intent is to not to take advantage of 11/4, leaving room for factual material, then it should be left in the legislation. If nothing else, the absence of the clause now means there is no capacity to hold the government to its commitment not to fund yes or no case advocacy. So his submission is that the removal of S11/4, going with a civics campaign, that civics campaign can stray into a yes or no answer, I believe, and we have no, by removing it, we have no ability to enforce it. Have you examined that, or can you go and examine that and get back to us on notice?
So a couple of things. Yeah, as I said,
Yep.
until
Yeah,
now,
absolutely.
we do not have the benefit of the submission, so it's hard for us to respond to that. But under 11, I think your question is, with the suspension of 11/4, could the government then... So the government's stated position is it will not fund a yes and no
Correct.
campaign, and your question is, if it did fund a yes and no
If
campaign...
the civics campaign funded into one side of the argument, there is no enforcement on that anymore. It can easily do that.
It would be possible for the civics campaign to provide a range of information with the suspension of 11/4.
So it is possible that the civics campaign could stray into promoting or negating aspects of the referendum because that 11 has been removed. Possible.
So suspending 11/4, yes, could allow for further information to be provided, but I would say that the government's stated position is that they do not intend to fund a yes or no campaign, and if that changed, there are other mechanisms with which the Parliament could look at that matter.
Okay. I'll just say there's some concerns around that. Madam Chair, knowing that my erstwhile colleague has about 24
more
moments.
questions?
Yeah, I'll pass.
Cool. Thank you. Following up some questions asked by Senator Cadell and also Senator Waters, just in relation to the pamphlet, where did the request to insert the disapplication of Section 11 of the Referendum Machinery 12 Provisions Act 1984 originate?
Sorry, can you just repeat that question?
So where did the request to insert the disapplication of Section 11 of the Referendum Machinery 12 Provisions Act 1984 originate? So this is the suspension of Section 11 that has been asked about previously. So where did that come from? Was that originated from a minister's office?
There's been a range, as I said earlier, there's been a range of advice put forward to government. There have been a number of discussions, consultations. It's an iterative process. I will take on notice if we can find that exact part. But there have been a number of options put forward to government and discussed with government, and questions coming back. So it's very hard to be able to signal one point where that's occurred, but we'll take it on notice.
If you could take it on notice, and which minister made the decision and on what date, and you've touched on it to an extent, but was the request made in consultation with any other ministers' offices?
By us? It's come through the work of the last few months, and as I said, ultimately this is the bill presents the government's position. Advice has gone to Cabinet, which I've acknowledged. I can't go to the nature of that advice.
So just in relation to when you've talked about Cabinet deliberations, in relation to those questions that I've put to you, can you please provide the individualised public interest immunity claims for each of those instances that you've claimed in relation to when you've been unable to answer the questions because you've said it's been through or subject to Cabinet deliberations? So if you could, on notice, I suspect,
yes,
can you please make that claim? Now, back to the rather than saying disapplication, let's say the suspension of Section 11, was the AEC consulted before the decision was made?
The AEC has been consulted throughout this process.
So they would have been consulted in relation to the suspension of Section 11?
The AEC has been consulted on all aspects of the legislation throughout this process.
Does the department know how many referendums have not provided a pamphlet outlining the arguments?
I think we do. Just let us take a look.
Senator, sorry, the question is how many times the...
Well, how many referendums have been put to the Australian people where a pamphlet has not been provided?
There's been 3, Senator.
Could you list those ones?
Yep. There was no pamphlet in 1919, in 1926 and in 1928.
There's also been 2 examples of where there's only been a yes pamphlet.
Okay. Has the department costed the provisions of a yes and no pamphlet to all households?
Through our costing process that supports Cabinet submissions, we would have costed a range of options that would have included the pamphlet.
Senator Goodell, I think, is interrupting me.
Thank you. Just
Senator
to follow up to your
again
previous
that we don't have much time, and apparently the Deputy Chair has many questions.
From your previous question, you give where there was no pamphlets or there was only a yes pamphlet. How many of those were where there was not bipartisan support?
I'm sorry, not...
So when the referendum question went through with bipartisan support, were they the only ones where there was a yes pamphlet from provided?
Presumably, yes, but we'll have to take that on notice.
Okay,
We're
thanks.
going back a number of years.
I can just give you quickly the reasons why there was no pamphlet in those years, if that would be useful. In 1919, there was insufficient time to write, prepare and post the pamphlet because it was held simultaneously with an early election in the aftermath of World War One. In 1926, a yes argument could not be agreed on, and therefore the pamphlet was temporarily suspended. And in 1928, support in Parliament and from the state governments was so widespread that it was agreed that no pamphlet was needed.
Has the department costed the provision of a pamphlet to all electors?
Need to take that on notice.
Okay. You take a notice, and
That would be a departure from the previous, the households, as you mentioned, so I'm not sure that we would have, but I'll take that on notice.
in relation to the costings for households and for all electors, can you table those costings or provide the figures?
I'll take that on notice.
And did the department provide those figures to the government?
I'll take that on notice.
Okay. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission has reported that 92% of the respondents to its news survey had some concern about the quality of news and journalism they were consuming. And last month said that analysis had identified concerning consumer and competition harms across a range of digital platform services that are widespread, entrenched and systemic. Noting this, did you provide an option to government to produce a pamphlet outlining the yes and no case to electors at the referendum?
And that goes to the nature of the advice we provided the government. I'll take that on notice.
So you can take it on notice, and if not, why not? And what rationale has been provided for not pursuing an official pamphlet for the referendum?
So, as my colleague mentioned, I mean, the pamphlet has been around for a number of years. We are now in a different technological age where there are other forms of communication that are readily available and used, ranging from television, email, social media, etc. So the government's position is that there are other ways that parliamentarians are able to engage with the process, the debate, and inform Australians about positions for the yes or the no side.
So will parliamentarians be given extra resources to promote the yes or no case?
That's a matter for government.
Now, in relation to your answer, just go, not that one, but the one just before, where you said there are a variety of alternative mechanisms. Why has the government removed the requirement to provide even a digital version of the pamphlet?
The government's position is that parliamentarians have a range of communication channels available to them that they use on a regular basis, and they are the options for communicating their position on the referendum.
But the question actually is about the substance, and the substance is having a digital version of the pamphlet that could, as per the process that is run through, where you've got the printed version, there's a yes case and a no case that's agreed by parliamentarians. Why has the government Why has the government removed the requirement to have even a digital version of that, so that the parliamentarians can communicate the official yes and no cases?
I can't go any further than giving you the government's policy position on this. Your question's now asking me why the government has or hasn't done something, but I can give you the government's policy position on this, and I'm sorry, but I can't go further than that.
Is the department concerned that the absence of an official yes and no pamphlet will mean that there won't be a balanced debate?
I think you're asking for a view there.
Senator, again, just noting time, are there other burning questions you want to get on the record?
I do. I've got pages of questions,
Pages
so
of
it may be
questions,
that we
goodness.
do come back in January then. So so that the opposition can fully go through our questions in relation to these changes. Just so whether it's the opposition's view that any constitutional change should be carefully considered, and therefore any changes to the governing legislation should be also carefully considered and should not be rushed through. That the government's timetable is for the committee to report in the first week of February, and if we have to come back in January to allow the opposition to put further questions, and the opposition will certainly encourage and be supportive of that move.
Excellent. I would note that I'm sure there have been a number of meetings between departments and others given the lack of work done on this legislation in the past decade. Anything further you wanted to get onto the record now, or shall we?
Well, I've got a small area I could just go to. How does the current scheme for appointing scrutineers and managing electoral workers operate? Okay, there'll be 2 questions here. 3, sorry.
We'll just see if we've got a bit of information there. Some of it's a bit of a crossover in the practicalities of the AEC on the day, but we'll just see.
Yeah.
We'll take that on notice. We're not going to be able to do it quickly for you. I'm sorry. Send it.
Senator, I'll just make one very quick comment that scrutineers can be appointed by political parties. There's some particular provisions in the Referendum Act around the Governor-General appointing a scrutineer in each of the governors of the states, so we can give a more fulsome answer to you on notice.
Because you know, on notice then, how does that scheme differ from the one proposed for the referendum? Because we won't have an official yes and no case.
Senator, there's no interaction between the official yes and no case and the appointment of scrutineers. I might also add the bill presented to Parliament doesn't amend those, doesn't change those requirements.
So I think it's quite important that you do take on notice to assist the deliberations of this committee. Answers to that question, and also that under the current scheme, registered political parties will provide for the authorisation of scrutineers beyond those allowed for through appointments made by governors, as you alluded to. And I think you've touched upon this. Does the proposed legislation seek to change that arrangement? And if you could take that on notice, considering the time.
Actually, Senator, I could very quickly answer that. The only change that the bill makes to scrutineers at all is just that scrutineers must be appointed in the prescribed form. That's an alignment with the Electoral Act, so that scrutineers are appointed in writing.
So, just to assist me, if you could take on notice that how someone who wishes to scrutineer at either the opening of the ballot boxes or for the actual counting, how a citizen of Australia can become a scrutineer under the proposed changes or the existing, if the changes that are accepted by Parliament as proposed by this bill, how someone can be a scrutineer for this referendum. On notice, just to assist the deliberations.
We'll take that on notice.
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. One further question from me, which is just to go to an issue that was raised in a few of our submissions, which was around the charity status of a Yes campaign organisation and donations for the campaign. Can you clarify for us that this bill doesn't prevent gifts or contributions to political parties or relevant charitable organisations which may, in the referendum, support a no campaign?
Chair, if I understand your question, is that there's nothing in this bill that prevents a donation to
a no campaign being a charitable donation?
There is nothing in this bill or the Act that prevents a donation being made to a no campaign.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for your attendance today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
And I now call representatives from the Australian Electoral Commission to give evidence. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Tom Rogers, Australian Electoral Commissioner.
And Jeff Pope, Deputy Electoral Commissioner.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Did you want to make an opening statement or shall we go straight to discussion?
Straight to it, I think, Chair.
Great. So we had a similar question put to Finance, but from your perspective, can you explain to us how the provisions in this bill would update a voter's experience to bring it into line with a federal election experience?
Thanks, Chair. Obviously, when voters do attend a polling place, you'd like that experience to be common. And quite often in the past, the Referendum Act was updated pretty much at the same time as the Electoral Act. I think that stopped a few years ago for whatever reason, 2017, thereabouts. So this also updates the Act to bring it into line with the sort of processes that people see at a normal federal election, including postal voting, pre-poll voting, and those sorts of issues. And uniquely, sorry, Chair, for this one, obviously, with funding and disclosure matters and authorisation as well.
So the funding and disclosure will essentially be as it occurs in a federal election now?
That's correct.
So do you see any of the measures in the bill that present any challenges to your ability to conduct a referendum?
Well, that's a large question, Chair. I don't think there are always challenges with any electoral event, and this referendum is no different. I don't see any necessary challenges to us delivering the election, but there are some opportunities that we've outlined in our submission.
We might go to those opportunities then. You have suggested some improvements to remote area mobile polling. Can you tell us why you think that would be useful in this context?
We've outlined a couple of key opportunities that we think will ensure that every Australian will get to have their say at the event. The issue of remote area mobile polling, in the submission, we've tried to tie the opportunity for RAMP, if I can use that an acronym, to pretty much the same experience that someone not in a remote area would have access to postal voting, to try and align that opportunity to expand the period in which we can offer that remote mobile polling. Chair, I know you know this from the other hearings we've had about, at the JSCEM's had about the 2022 election, but RAMP is a very complex service delivery area. It does take time, and for us to get around the number of communities, any extra period that we can get will really assist that process. I'm not sure whether the Deputy might like to add to that.
Chair, the only thing I'd add is the logistics are so challenging in that environment that one disruption can actually put out the delivery in terms of timeframes, delay half a day, 2 days. And we experienced that in this election. So it can be a weather event, it could be a technical issue with a light aircraft or a helicopter, it could be a car accident whilst the polling staff are out and about, or it could be cultural issues where the community is not available on the day that we're intending to do polling. All of those can happen and do happen from time to time.
And we might just add, actually did happen at the last event. There was a serious road accident. We had a plane that broke down and our team were trapped at an airfield for a night and couldn't get to the next community, and these things have a big impact.
So this suggestion of extra days is really to give you extra time to get those logistics to get to remote
To
communities.
get the logistics together, and if there is a need for us to actually readjust those logistics during the period, to actually have time to do so.
You've also made a suggestion around secure telephone voting, which was used during the federal election for people who are isolating for COVID reasons. Is that something that you think would be useful in a referendum context?
We really do, Chair. We put it in there as an opportunity, and we're not saying that this is a must-do, but it would provide an extra level of assurance if properly regulated with requirements around it that didn't make it open slather for everybody, but for a range of individuals who couldn't otherwise access the vote. And I think we've put some examples in the submission. It might be if there's some sort of pandemic-related issue preventing us getting into aged care homes, the residents of those homes may be able to access secure telephone voting. It could be too that remote communities we might have had RAMP scheduled, but RAMP couldn't get there for a particular reason, might be able to access secure telephone voting. Depending on what the committee feels, it could even be examined for citizens overseas who are not otherwise access a postal vote or able to get to one of our diplomatic missions. It might also be a measure that they might care to use as well. And I know you'll be aware, Chair, from some of the evidence given at the JSCM post-federal election 2022, some of the overseas citizens felt under-serviced during COVID. We weren't able to open all of those missions, and it could be a fail-safe mechanism for those individuals. And there could be others as well that the committee might consider be worthwhile.
Okay. And I think the sort of final suggestion you've made in that space of enfranchisement is the possibility of enrolment on the day. Can you talk about how that would operate and what that would entail?
There are a couple of the state commissions that already have that provision in. I'm not sure. I think Queensland is one of them, and South Australia and Victoria. Chair, if I just talk for a moment, and that's for all Australians, if I can just put that on the table, but if we look at the role, we think over the last 6 years in particular, we've made huge inroads into Indigenous enrolment. It currently is the highest level it has been since Federation. The last 2 years are the biggest 2 years of sustained growth in the Indigenous role again since Federation. But there will be some people, for whatever reason, who are not able to access enrolment services before the day, and this would ensure that those individuals' votes would be included. They would go in to a polling place, be given a provisional vote, and we would treat that as an enrolment form, and as long as we could establish their identity, that vote would then be counted. And again, it's a fail-safe mechanism to make sure that every Australian can have their say. Now, it is not something that we would want people to rely on as a normal form of enrolment, because obviously the workload becomes quite huge on the day, and we would be running the same sorts of enrolment activities before each electoral event that we're currently doing. We're very proud of the fact that we've got the highest level of enrolment. I think it's over 97% at the moment. It's an amazing result. But this does provide, a final fail-safe mechanism. I think it's also important for us to have opportunities like that, frankly, so that people can't say, I was prevented from voting and I didn't get to have my say. It's a mechanism that people can then, there's no excuse for people not turning up and voting on the day.
Okay. I might turn to education, particularly given we haven't held a referendum in this country for so long. There are essentially probably a couple of generation of voters who won't ever have participated in a referendum. What will the AEC's role be in educating those voters about how a referendum works?
Thanks, Chair. Our role is, and I need to be really clear here, totally focused on the process rather than the content of the referendum. We won't be touching the content of the referendum, but we will be preparing a campaign that talks about the why, how to vote formally, the process by which you can vote, and raising people's awareness of those issues. And we've already started work on a campaign, but it will not mention the subject matter. In fact, if we get it right, it should be a campaign that we could use for other referenda, should that be the case in the future.
And would you be expecting to use the similar sort of methods and channels that you do in your education campaigns around a federal election?
Absolutely.
Similarly, for misinformation and disinformation, the committee's heard concerns about that in a referendum environment. What would you see as the AEC's role being in countering possible misinformation and disinformation, and how would you go about this?
Thanks, Chair. Pretty much the same as we do at election time. We're very focused on the process rather than the content. And I know we've had lengthy discussions at the JSCM about this issue about truth in advertising and a range of other issues. And for us, it's about the process and defending the process, and also managing the reputation of the process so that people can have confidence that, first of all, the vote that they cast will be counted the way that it's cast. And secondly, that they have confidence and trust in the result. We'll be doing the same sorts of activities that we did at the last event, including a very strong social media presence, the Electoral Integrity Assurance Task Force. We'll be keeping a close eye on what's occurring and providing me advice about what's occurring. We're doing our own monitoring as well. We'll do our own media work. And I would point out also, Chair, that just so we're not confused, separate to the whole issue that you've been discussing with the yes-no case, we will also send out a booklet about the referendum, but it'll be like we do normally about a householder guide about the election to inform citizens about the process and what they need to do as well. So there'll be a heavy education campaign.
Okay. And will the Electoral Integrity Task Force operate in much a similar way as it does during a federal election?
Absolutely, with input from the same agencies that exist at a federal election as well.
We have also heard and had in submissions around that issue of truth in political advertising that we are looking at in our inquiry into the 2022 election. Some submitters have suggested that that should be brought forward for this referendum. I am conscious of some evidence we heard from the South Australian Electoral Commissioner just recently in that inquiry, talking about how, in his view, given they have a model there, for any federal model to be successful, it will need a sufficient level of time and effort and resources for all parties to understand it and to implement it. Do you have thoughts on whether, if we're looking at holding a referendum next year, that would allow the AEC time to implement a possible truth in political advertising regime and communicate that well with all parties involved?
Chair, I don't want to sound trite. If Parliament asks us to do something, we will absolutely do it. But I need to be very clear that there will be a resource bill attached to that. And I know the South Australian Commissioner and Commission do a great job. We work very closely with them. But the state election is many times smaller than a federal event, even in terms of just the media footprint. So the level of work involved in that will be significant, should that occur, and we'll need to be adequately resourced for that. It'll be a very, very steep project for us to be able to do it. But again, if Parliament asks us to do that, we'll pull out every stop and we'll make it happen.
All right. Senator Cadell.
Thank you. Before I get into the process question, similar to Mr. Barella, two things you raised. I'm a National Party MP, the RAMP program. Isn't it easier now to do more than 12 days because we don't have to print ballot papers with known candidates? We know everything in advance. Isn't it significantly easier to do a longer lead time in a referendum than a general election now?
That's correct, Senator. Yep.
And would be opportunity to test out other ways of doing things because you know that there's less unknowns?
Well, it depends how radical you're going to head, Senator. I think it provides opportunities for us to certainly extend RAMP because it's just nowhere near as complex with the ballot papers as you pointed out. So it's one of the reasons why we're comfortable making that recommendation in our submission, and we do think that is an easier process.
Okay. We'll now get on to the process questions, if we may. When was the AEC first consulted on the changes to the Referendum Machinery Act?
We've been part of the interdepartmental committee. I don't have in front of me when that process first started, Senator. I'm happy to take that one on notice, unless the deputy has that to hand.
I don't have the date of when we first saw the draft bill. Is that sort of the focus of it?
I have a feeling there'll be lots of on-notice questions here. That's fine.
Right, far away.
Yeah, we'll get that date. And when did you first get the draft of the legislation? If you could have a look at that for me.
We'll take that on notice.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, what feedback was asked for by the committee? Have you generally saw it? Were there concerns with that you've fed back into government, or were you pretty happy?
Can I just say, Senator, whenever we get any draft bill, our feedback is always based on the operational implications only,
Yep.
is the only lens that we ever provide comment through.
It's sort of capability and capacity are the issues that we normally talk about rather than the policy behind it. So.
Going to that point, I think the legislation proposes that the referendums, I asked a question earlier and they didn't recall that in their own legislation that's proposed to be held between 2 and 6 months prior to passing both houses, the referendum, I think, is that correct?
I think that's the constitutional issue.
It's the Constitution that after the Constitutional Amendment Bill has been passed,
Yep.
the referendum must be held not less than 2 months and not more than 6 months after the passing of that bill, is my understanding.
That's as I did. So it is extremely likely donations may be taken prior that 6 month period. I mean, it would have to be the last day for the donation laws to comply perfectly under that. So it is a retrospective compliance program, isn't it?
That's right. As I understand it, that's correct, Senator.
Yep. Have you ever had experience with auditing going through a retrospective compliance program before?
Well, I guess most funding and disclosure is really retrospective in any case, the way it's currently set up. But I think, as we've said in our submission, Senator, what would be required with this one, if it goes through the way it is a very heavy education campaign so that everyone's aware of those requirements. But yes, it could well be that there are obligations that people are accruing potentially without knowing that they're accruing those things.
They could be doing it already.
Potentially.
Okay. Was the Special Minister of State, they were aware of your involvement going through this process and the consultation, the AECs you've written to them as part of this interdepartmental committee?
Well, we provide feedback as part of the IDC. I'm not sure whether the Minister would be personally aware, but I'm sure he's generally aware that we're part of the IDC.
Okay. Are you aware of any bodies or organisations who have been established with the sole purpose of organising electoral activities with a referendum, a yes or no campaign group?
Not that I'm aware of, Senator.
Okay, thanks. And similar question, we don't know they exist, but there will be an official, we can presume, there will be an official yes and a no campaign. Do we see any ongoing electoral involvement for those, or do you think there'll be single purpose entities, special purpose entities just for that?
Wouldn't know, Senator. I couldn't answer that one.
Have you or the AEC undertaken any research in regards the polling or community research in regards to the proposed referendum?
Not in regards to the proposed referendum, but I mentioned before, Senator, that we've started the preparation of a campaign on the referendum itself. We always do, as part of the preparation of any of those advertising campaigns we do, normal marketing analysis. I'm presuming we've already started that as part of the ad campaign that we're doing, but that's not necessarily about the referendum itself or what people think of the referendum.
I've seen some digital marketing recruiting Indigenous Australians target. That's following on from what we're talking about further, trying to improve that even more. That's nothing to do with just general. Yep. On the financial disclosure, how does the current legislation, as it stands, propose to track the flow of money from a donor to an entity, given there can be so many more entities involved in this?
Senator, exactly as per a federal election, as you know, we'll get that information after the event, after people are required to fill in various disclosure documents, which we ask them to fill in and then submit at various times. So all of that will become known retrospectively. Before the event, we won't know before the event how that money is flowing through various accounts, the same as we don't at election time. So,
and forgive lack of preparation on my part on this. I'm just unaware because it's not a campaign, it's a referendum. I haven't done one. Is there authorisation of ads required for a referendum? Yes. Right, there is. So, okay, but many more players, even that's going to be harder to... Everyone's going to have a view from different groups.
Well, Senator, there's always issues with authorisations at every election. In fact, it's our stock in trade. We could reform that a bit. That'd be a whole other story. But yes, it'll be something that we need to examine and also make sure that all of that material is properly authorised, which at the moment does take a lot of time for an election. I'm presuming this will be. There'll be a lot more phone calls from us to entities to remind them of their obligations. Okay. But part of that, Senator, will have to be an education campaign before the event so that people are absolutely aware, individuals and entities are absolutely aware of their obligations and requirements before the event.
In relation to that, in the absence of an official yes and no campaign, one of the concerns that I have is that political parties, as you touched upon, who deal with compliance and authorisation issues on a regular basis, still make mistakes, unintentionally. In the absence of an established framework, how do you see yourself dealing with 1,000 flowers bloom when you're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of groups across Australia on the yes and no side, dealing with, sometimes it's quite complex, the rules governing elections. How do you see the AEC dealing with that could be quite difficult and complicated for the AEC as an organisation?
Senator, first of all, I'd back up what you said about most errors at election time, even from established parties, are actually inadvertent. It's quite clear that the vast majority of issues to do with authorisations with political parties are inadvertent. And as a result, we take an educative approach with everybody rather than just a hostile approach up front, and we work with parties and entities. We would be doing the same at a referendum, that educative approach first. Again, I would presume that errors that might creep in, most of which would be inadvertent, but it will need to be adequately resourced so that, again, citizens can understand where information is coming from. We'll have to be very active in that space, and I'm presuming that that will mean we'll be making far more phone calls, emails and letters than we normally do to ensure that people understand what they're doing. But I do think that the critical bit will be an education campaign on this to start with so that people are aware of the requirements.
On that point, Mr Rogers, you would have done a budget for what you think will be required of this? Are you confident? Have you got an undertaking that will be met, or are you confident in your resources?
Senator, that work is still underway. We can't finalise the budget until the bill has been finalised, until we know exactly what we're dealing with. Yeah. So we're working on that process as we speak, and we'll be probably all the way through to the May budget.
That's great. I think we've answered some of those questions. How did the AEC assess the application of the current donations regime that we're talking about in a federal electoral event against this referendum? We're talking about alignment earlier. Do you think the alignment will make it easier for you guys?
I would point out that funding and disclosure is possibly one of the most complex areas of the Electoral Act, and I know that you would understand, Senator, in particular, that estimates it's the #1 topic of conversation and has been for the last decade.
Try being a state director and lodging the...
So you understand the complexity involved in this, so I suspect that this will remain complex. However, given the fact that it is aligned, it does mean that we've got a basis there to move forward. Again, there'll be a significant increase in workload, and that will, if it goes through in its current format, we'll need to be resourced accordingly to be able to ensure that we are living up to the requirements of that legislation.
Okay. You speak about current format. Was there a phase when we're going through assessment? Did you ever think there'd be an official yes and no campaign? That's obviously changed now.
That's no view on that, Senator. That was clearly a matter for government.
And how does the proposed legislation consider dealing with entities who have expended money on electoral activities so far but have not previously put a financial disclosure in?
There's the sort of novice one-off entities. Again, the education campaign will be critical on that so that they're aware of what their requirements are before the event and then working with them during the event to make sure that they understand it. As you know, Senator, at the end of every election, there's a lot of interaction between us and entities in any case to make sure they understand what their requirements are. We do a broad search through media, social media as well. We analyse the environment because sometimes people are simply unaware, even at election time, that they've got an obligation to report on various things. We do our best to try and bring that to their attention. At elections, slightly different. There is no shortage of what I would call whistleblowers from other parties telling us about what other parties are doing. And we use that information as well. So there'll be a whole range of information that we use.
Okay. Madam Chair, once again, we have reams of binders are full, but I'll hand over if you want to share.
Thank you. We do have other people waiting to ask questions. Senator Waters.
Thanks very much, Chair, and hi there, Commissioner.
G'day, Senator.
Hey, hi. We've covered a lot of the questions that I had, but I'm interested to understand, given the donations framework which will apply, and we've covered the potentially retrospective nature of some of that, depending on the date, I'm interested in what is the disclosure time frame after the referenda is done. When will the public find out who funded which side of the campaign?
I am informed, Senator, it's 24 weeks after the event.
Okay, so it won't be the fixed date of the 1st of Feb, it will be 24 weeks from the date of the referendum. Okay, thank you. And will it be uploaded in a similar sort of way and accessible through similar means as the normal 1st of February donations data?
Our aim will be to make that as transparent as possible, and it will certainly be available online. It won't be loaded into the same system that we've currently got, because I can't see. But yes, something like that, Senator, it will be online so that everyone is able to access that information, and it'll be as transparent as we can possibly make it.
Okay, thank you. You were asked by another senator about the resources that you might need to develop so that people understand what their donation disclosure obligations are, and you said that you're still working out what the budget might be because you need to wait to at least until it's considered by Parliament. What sort of lead time do you think would be required to create that donation disclosure information?
A bit hard to give you an exact figure with that, Senator, other than to say the more time we get, the better that will be. But no matter what time we get, we will do some sort of education campaign. We're very skilled at doing that in any case. We turn things around very quickly, and we will make sure that there is sufficient information out there for people to understand their obligations. The second part of that is that it's not a one-off sealed event. We'll also work with those individuals and entities even during the event itself to make sure they're aware of their obligations.
Okay, thank you. Now, the chair asked about this, but my connection was a bit sketchy, so apologies if I'm doubling up here. Just in relation to the length of the remote polling period, you've suggested that it be increased by a week up to 90 days. Why 19, and is that enough? And would you like to see that become a permanent period for all future referenda?
Well, Senator, I think we would like to see that become a feature for future referenda, but not for elections, because that becomes more complex with the production of the ballot papers, which was something I was covering with Senator Cadell before. So for a referendum, we've got the opportunity to actually do that, and we should do it. The extension itself, I think, will provide adequate time for us to provide a heavy footprint with remote area mobile polling, along with a range of other polling options, so that people don't miss out on their option of having their say. And I think, as we pointed out in our submission, what we've tried to do is to say individuals in remote communities, we've tried to tie the level of ramp to what you might get from postal services in non-remote areas. So there's a degree of equity there as well. As you know, in very remote areas, postal services are not always reliable. So it's a way of us ensuring that everyone gets to have their say.
Okay, thank you. Now, you were asked about phone voting. I heard your response on that. Can I just go back to the civics campaign? You said earlier that you'd likely produce a booklet, if memory serves me correctly, would outline
a household guide, Senator. Yep.
A household guide, okay, so an outline of the process of how to vote, and you made it clear that you wouldn't speak to the content of the vote. I understand that distinction. Have you got budget for that, or will you need additional budget for that? And I'm interested in language translation as well. How do you choose which languages to translate to, and will you pay particular attention to First Nations languages given the content of the upcoming referendum?
I might start off, Senator, and then I might ask the Deputy to join, but at the last election, we translated much of our material into more Indigenous languages than we've ever translated previously. I think, in fact, 20 Indigenous languages in addition to 32 culturally and linguistically diverse languages. So it's the biggest translation push that we've ever had. We would aim for the householder guide to be translated as well. In terms of the number of languages, we work with other groups to work out which languages we should do. I mean, clearly there's a limit. just the sheer number of languages that we can translate to. But we're doing a pretty good job at the moment with translation in any case. In terms of the budget, the householder guide is always included within the budget for the election in any case. I need to be very clear with the distinction. I'm not talking about a yes-no booklet, but the householder guide about the election itself. And that was certainly included in the budget for the last election. And the very, very broad indications we provided to government about costings for that, that would be included in that process, the householder guide. But the Deputy might care to...
So we'll do pretty much exactly what we did, Senator, for the householder guide earlier this year for the election. We will consider translation into the appropriate languages and whether they are also Indigenous languages for the referendum.
You'll consider that?
We haven't made a decision yet as to whether the householder guide will be translated into Indigenous languages yet.
Oh, okay. So there's some potential that it won't be?
What hasn't been in the past, so the 32 languages that the Commissioner was referring to are foreign languages that we translate into routinely. We do translate, as the Commissioner also indicated, many of our educative and awareness products into about 20 Indigenous languages. But the householder guide is quite a large document, and that is something that we'll need to explore as to whether there's translators available, whether there is sufficient time for us to work through.
But what we always have in that householder guide, Senator, are links to translation services that people can access, which is what we normally do as well. So we'll be doing the same thing with that. And as we work through that, we'll make some other decisions with the householder guide, but there'll be lots of other material that is also translated.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm just a little bit baffled now. So we don't have an official neutral yes, no, this is what it means document, whether that be digital or otherwise. And you're saying it's still under consideration whether you will translate the householder guide into First Nations languages. And I hear that you've done 20 in the past, but obviously there's far more than 20 First Nations languages in this country. How are people going to understand what it is that they're voting on and they vote if you're not going to be able to do the translation of at least the household guide? Well, surely you would just ask for more funding from government so that you could do the translation so that people understand.
We, just to clarify that, we, in the householder guide, which is a very large document already, we provide on that links to translation services online and on phone that people can access that translated material. So that's already there. At the last election, we translated much of our other educative material, because it's not just the householder guide, Senator, there's a whole range of other things that are available, into, I think it was 32 cold languages, 20 Indigenous languages. And then when we deliver information into communities, quite often there are native speakers within those groups that then assist further in contextualising that information. Now, of course, even if just put aside Indigenous languages for a moment, there are far more than 32 called languages in Australia as well, but there's just a limit to how many languages that we can actually access and translate. But what we do, and again, the Deputy...
Why is there a limit?
You just broke up, Senator. Sorry, you...
Why is there a limit?
So our data indicates, Senator, I mean, we use ABS data, and some of the data that I've seen indicates that it gets to a point where the cost, you're spending a huge amount of money for an audience of potentially 1,500 people, and the data indicates that the levels of English proficiency in that 1,500 people is already quite high.
We don't just make these decisions ourselves either, Senator. We work with a range of other groups about what languages we should translate into. Based on our experience over many elections, it does seem to work pretty well with the feedback that we get, and we work with Indigenous groups as well to work out which languages that we should translate into. And so when I say there's a limit, there is a limit at a point where either it simply is not effective or efficient to do that at the very small end, or the timing is such that we simply won't be able to translate into that number of languages that amount of material.
Or translation, or translators, accredited translators may not be available at that time for some of those languages, so which are less common. I also just want to circle back on one of your comments earlier, because I just want to make sure we're all very clear. The booklet, the householder booklet, will tell electors where to vote and how to cast a formal vote.
But not the case
It'll have nothing at all to do with the subject matter of the referendum.
Yes, I think that's painfully clear.
Okay.
It's potentially a policy issue that's not one where there's unanimous view amongst the senators, but the fact that there won't be a yes/no official campaign that's posted out by government is sadly, tragically clear. Okay, can I just ask now, and this is based upon evidence that you've given to us in previous inquiries about the rate of increase of Indigenous enrolment, and I know you were at pains to talk about how the rate of increase of Indigenous enrolment was greater from memory than the non-Indigenous rate of increase of enrolment. So I accept that. But I'm interested in how confident you are in the data that you base those conclusions on, given the latest figures from the Indigenous estimated residential population figures from the ABS, which are based on the 2021 census. Just had some experts raise some concerns about those latest figures and contrast that with the evidence provided previously.
Yeah, thanks, Senator. Look, obviously we're using a particular data set. We have to use a data set. We use that from the ABS. We run that data through a range of other metrics, and we've looked at this over a number of years. We're pretty confident with the figures that we've got based on those metrics. And I think along with the movement of the general roll, if I can use that term, there's been a huge increase in the estimated Indigenous roll, and it's critical for us to keep talking about estimated when we say this, because there is no requirement for anyone to identify whether they're Indigenous or not on the enrolment form. So all of this is estimated. But we think there's been a huge increase. I'm confident in the data. As more data comes to hand, we will use that data to further analyse what we're doing. I think the next time we'll publish that data is probably in February, and I suspect that's going to increase again because of several trials that we're undertaking at the moment. And I think we've spoken about some of those trials, Senator, at the other Joint Standing Committee hearings. Currently, the Indigenous enrolment rate, I think, is hovering at around about 82% or thereabouts nationally. I think as a result of some of the trials that we're doing, there'll be a significant increase in that again by the time we get to February. So those trials are working, and there are, there are green shoots all over the place with Indigenous enrolment. Now, of course, the other way of looking at that is Indigenous enrolment is still not at the level of the general roll, and that's absolutely true. And we're committed to trying to make sure that's, that issue is resolved. But over the last 6 years, we've seen huge sustained increase. Last 2 years, the biggest 2-year increase that we've ever seen, and there are more Indigenous Australians on the roll than there've ever been before. We're outstripping the growth in the growth in the number of eligible Indigenous Australians to be on the roll. So we're very proud of the work that we're doing and what we're achieving with that. So I understand there's a level of frustration, which I get, but in terms of closing the gap, this is actually a demonstration of where the gap is actually being closed by the activities being undertaken by the AEC. I would point out, though, Senator, just because I've got the floor, that what we've advised as an opportunity for enrolment on the day would really assist that process to make sure that no one is turned away from a polling place.
Yeah, thank you. I hear your strong proposal for enrolment on the day. It's something that my party supports as well, and take that into consideration. Just one final question, if I could, Chair, and then I'll be done. Commissioner, can you explain to me, just in the data sets that you've referenced to track Indigenous enrolment statistics, what are the consequences of using one data set for your denominator, which I understand is your ABS Indigenous voting age population estimate, and a different data set for your numerator, which I understand is Services Australia data. What are the consequences for using those different data sets and the veracity of the conclusions that you can draw from them?
I might take that on notice if you don't mind, Senator. I'll come back with a comprehensive answer for you.
Okay, sure. Look, thanks very much for your time today and for your work. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Grogan.
Thank you. A lot of my questions have been answered, so some of this will just be follow-up on things you've already started talking about. But the whole idea of a neutral civics education program, in running that, I know in the 2022 election you did a range of work with other organisations such as Umiora Radio in South Australia. Would you be looking at those kind of partnerships again to have those organisations such as that Indigenous controlled and run station talking to the community to build that education?
Senator, it's a really good point. One of the key things that any electoral management body has to maintain is its neutrality. In the modern era in particular, people always perceive that any entity either swings one way or another. The moment you say something that they're not happy with, suddenly you're aligned with the other side. It's particularly the case with a referendum. This referendum where, any referendum is about an issue that the public feel very passionate about quite often, and this will certainly be one of those issues. We've got to be very careful about how we're aligned, but we also have to explain to people that our role is not as part of Team Yes or Team No, but rather Team Neutral. And so we're going to have to do a lot of work with organisations that we're partnering with so that they understand what our role is and what their role is, and that it's not only the fact that we are neutral but perceived to be neutral is critically important. I'm not sure whether the Deputy wanted to add to that, but it's a critical thing.
Well, and so just a point of clarification there. I guess that's kind of why I'm asking the question, because they are an Indigenous organisation, and it is, you have been worked with them before to reach out to a community that maybe isn't listening to the mainstream media or whatever. So I guess that was really the essence of my question. Thank you.
We do work with them, and in fact I've done some interviews with them, and they are actually one of our 82 Indigenous partners, Senator. So this is another educative piece that we're going to have to work through with those organisations that are formally partnering with us in Indigenous Australia, delivering services on the ground that we sort of run along or ask them to deliver on our behalf. And there will have to be some very strong education and guidance provided, but there may well be some challenging moments to navigate through.
Okay, thank you.
But I guess wrapping up, we're very aware of it, and we're aware of our reputations.
Yeah, because they were surprised at how positive the experience was, which is not surprising. Because I know a bunch of the young people who are working there were like saying, "Oh no, voting's for old people. We don't do that." So it was really great to see the partnership that you built with them actually genuinely made a difference about their engagement in the process.
They've been an excellent partner.
The other thing, the issue of not sending out a pamphlet with 2,000 words on either side. There's a lot of the subs that we've received who said that they've often been emotive and misleading because they're done by the people who are pushing the two messages. And your position about there being, and a number of people's position that there being a lot of other avenues now that it maybe isn't a valuable piece. In terms of engagement with the AEC, do you have a sense of how people's engagement with you has changed over time? Do you track statistics of increased sort of online engagement or telephone engagement or whatever? Do you have any sense from that?
And Senator, just to be clear, I'm not trying to be obscure, but we have no position on the yes/no booklet. It's purely a matter for government.
Sorry, my apologies.
Just to be very clear. Look, it is changing. The householder guide that we send out at election time, I think is still, the research that we do shows about 40% of people still use that as a primary source of information about the electoral process, differentiating that from the yes/no booklet, about the electoral process itself. I do know that radio is incredibly important, particularly in remote communities and particularly in Indigenous communities. It does appear that newspaper advertisements are becoming less important. I don't want to just talking about our experience, so all of a sudden we're not getting journalists that are upset that I've said that. Just from our experience in terms of the advertising that we do in newspapers is becoming less important. So that is changing, and the other bit that's changing, not relevant I think to where you're heading, but before 2000 up till 2016, virtually all communication, immediate communication between us and citizens was either through our call centre or email. And now we're finding a very large number of direct messages through social media rather than through email or phone. So the way in which we communicate at election time is changing significantly.
Because the sense of not doing newspaper notification of locations for polling booths, and I'm well, I won't guess. I'll ask: is that your rationale there, that there just isn't that engagement, and people are more likely to look it up online?
They look online.
Yeah.
If they want the information, they look online, and all the information is there, readily accessible, and in a far more accessible and economical way than through the newspaper.
And just a point of clarity, with the household booklet, did you say that you published the list of polling places in there as well?
Not in the booklet.
No.
How to source.
How to find that.
Yeah.
So it would be clearly marked in there how they would then be able to find those things. Okay, lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Mr Chester.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Commissioner, and I'll take the opportunity to wish you and your staff Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Just building on, no worries, building on Senator Cadell's questions earlier, and really a process one around how you counter any misinformation. I noticed during the election campaign you used Twitter quite a lot. Who actually authorises your Twitter account, decides when you're going to publish or when you're not going to publish on any given issue?
Well, that's a very large question, if I might, for a moment. Our Twitter campaign is one part of a very large process undertaken by the AEC. And previously with the Joint Standing Committee, we've submitted, I think before the last election, our reputation management strategy, which spoke about how we were managing the reputation of both the AEC and the electoral process. Largely because we saw overseas, I'm not talking about any particular country, by the way, which is important, but we saw overseas stuff where electoral systems had been talked down, and we wanted to prevent that occurring in Australia, so we took a very proactive approach to how we did all of our social media, not just with Twitter. So in terms of, if you want to ask who is responsible, Mr Chester, that's me as Commissioner. I'm responsible for all communication that occurs within the AEC. If you're asking, do I clear every single tweet? The answer is absolutely not, because that's not how social media works. It just doesn't, because there's thousands upon thousands of tweets. During the election itself, I was involved on a daily basis, as were other members of the executive, in talking to the social media team, establishing firm guide rails, occasionally intervening, and either asking for something to be stopped, started or changed, and actively manage that all the way through.
Thanks, Commissioner. So what I'm taking from that is you have a clear policy around whether to engage or not engage,
Yep.
and you've got a monitoring process, I guess, focused on without putting words in your mouth, focused on the conduct of the referendum, but not on the content of what's being published.
That's absolutely correct.
So you won't be fact-checking people's campaigns and responding through your media channels. It'll be strictly limited to the process of the referendum.
Yeah, 100%, as we did at the election. And I know sometimes that annoys people because we get comments on our Twitter page saying this thing is blatantly wrong. But as you know, at election time, there are normally two views of most things. And so we're very, very careful not to do that. But we do correct misinformation about the electoral process, and we would do that exactly the same during the referendum.
Now, I guess I'm not expecting to answer this question, but just bear me out. From your experience, if people are making decisions based on false or misleading information, it wouldn't be consistent with our democratic values and traditions, would it?
I'm not sure I could comment on that one, Mr Chester. I think everyone's individual's motivations are different. Our bit is to make sure that people are aware of the electoral process and to manage the integrity of that process, and that's what we'll be doing during this event.
Thank you, Commissioner. My concern was just relating to whether people would have access to a single source of truth to base their decision on, but that's not really in your purview, I'm taking it.
If people are after a single source of truth about the electoral process, we're it, absolutely, 100%. In fact, allow me to warm to that task. While we're here, if anyone else is looking at any other social media account and taking their cues about the electoral process from those accounts, can I urge them to stop and look at the AEC, because we are the electoral experts in Australia, and I guarantee you we'll not provide you that misinformation. And some of the other quite odd accounts and quite odd information that are out there, I can absolutely guarantee that we'll be doing the same task. In terms of the content of any referendum, that won't be our bailiwick, that will be somebody else.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Commissioner.
Thank you. Ms Cheney.
Thank you, Chair. The Human Rights Law Centre has raised an issue that I'd love to get your response to. The Referendum Act includes a need to disclose referendum expenditure, which includes producing referendum matter. In the Electoral Act equivalent clause relating to electoral matter, there's a note indicating that it doesn't include education, raising awareness or encouraging debate on a public policy issue. But there's no equivalent exclusion in the current bill. So the effect of this is that disclosure of expenditure on neutral education material is also required. Can I have your thoughts on the impact or rationale for that difference between the Referendum Act and the Electoral Act?
I think that is more properly a question for government. So I'm not sure I can provide you an answer on that, and I'm not sure why that was not included. That might be a matter that we'll take on notice the bits of that we can, and the other bits I think that might be a matter for government, because it's actually a policy question about that process.
Okay, thank you.
Did you have further questions, Ms Cheney, or that's it? Okay.
No, that's one. Thank you.
Senator Cadell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A few questions earlier, and I think it's just touching on different perspectives about the foreign donation laws. So how does the current scheme as it go to electorate? Do you see any difference between the current electoral laws for elections versus the proposed changes for referenda, or do you see it now being perfectly in alignment?
Look, the process itself is in line, Senator. I guess I would point out the only difference, of course, is, and I'm just opining here.
Opine away.
Is that the funding and disclosure scheme at election time is retrospective. But I guess what citizens could use, the information that comes out many months after the event, to form a view about how they might vote in the future. A Funding and Disclosure Act for a one-off event, such as a referendum, which is also retrospective, won't provide citizens with that option. So other than that, the process themselves are aligned. The outcome will be slightly different.
Okay, thanks very much. We spoke about this is not yet law for this referendum changes. There may be organisations that have taken foreign donations in the past without knowing this was coming prior to exposure. You'll be in charge of going back. What would happen to an organisation that's taken funds, has no ability to repay those funds now? Are they in breach?
I'll have to look at the legislation that comes out, Senator, when it comes out, and I'd have to think about that and take that on. I'll take that on notice and come back to you with an answer.
And also, is there a time limit on that breach of the foreign donation? So could an organisation exist today that took funds 12 months ago, to promote the idea of a voice even before the legislation came out?
I'll take that on notice and come back to you.
And also, while we're on the notice page, how would you deal with an entity that is shut down since that period, who also took foreign donations?
We'll take that on notice, but I would point out that's also not completely unusual that sort of thing occurs, so we'll come back to you on that.
We've asked about the resources. Will you, when you're doing your planning, your budget, knowing it's a work in progress, will you be looking at extra funding for ongoing compliance post-election to make sure, chase up those people that may have done the wrong things and trying to get away with it, or will effectively you end the 14 weeks and 25 weeks after?
No, the cost of the referendum will absolutely have to include that, Senator.
Okay. You haven't worked out the budget, but have you been working out the material, the education campaign, about how you'll deal with prospective donors and prospective entities going forward, especially on the donor side, which could be an entirely different breed of donor in this campaign?
I think we're on record as saying that the cost of any referendum is likely to mirror, very broadly, the cost of an election.
Okay.
So we're on record, I'm pretty sure, of having said that, and if we're not, well, I'm now on record as saying that it's going to mirror broadly the cost of an election. So obviously there are some things we don't have to do at a referendum that we have to do at election time, but that will be largely balanced out by other things that we need to do to make sure that citizens can vote. So those broad costs in line, we have already started, as I mentioned before, developing a campaign which we will run out at a point in time when the legislation is passed. So that's already underway, and that cost will also be included within that broad cost of the referendum that we've already spoken broadly about at the IDC, I think.
And we have a good suite of education products already in existence for an election, which we would just look to update and nuance for a referendum in accordance with the final act when it's passed.
Okay. More general, off the books again. Asked previous witnesses about in-kind donations from foreign organisations such as technology, those things. How hard are they to track when there's not a ledger entity or bank account entry that these intangibles and the thing, are they difficult to for compliance?
Anything overseas is difficult,
Yep.
Senator, but we do that. After a federal election, as you know, we have a very strong compliance program where we select a range of entities to do a compliance review in the period after the election. We go through the entire process, including gifts in kind and a range of other measures, and we'll be doing the same thing at the referendum.
Okay. Moving on to the touchy subject, the issuing of the pamphlet or non-issuing the pamphlet, which you have no opinion of it. But does the AEC know where did the request to insert the disapplication of Section 11 of the referendum originate?
That's a matter for government, Senator.
You have no idea where it came from?
No.
Okay. That rules about the next three questions out. That's fine. You heard the previous witness now, AEC, talking about how many times there hasn't been a pamphlet issued, and those times are largely where there was bipartisan support from the parties of government, or I think one time out. Do you find it a dangerous precedent to remove that public funding from informing, otherwise or not, in your democracy that you control, or not control, you monitor?
Senator, I've been accused of many things in the past. Given this is a matter for government, we absolutely have no view on that.
None whatsoever. Have you done a costing? It wouldn't be your thing normally, but would you have done the costing we asked the previous on the issuing of a pamphlet to all households?
I think broadly we've provided some information. I think we've said, and again, Senator, this is a very rough cost, but I think in the order of about $10 million, I think. Something like that is probably part of the costings we've provided to the IDC or spoken about more broadly, but I hate giving a figure in this committee because then we're pinned to it. And
Happy to take it on notice if you can give that.
I don't think I'll be able to come much closer than the 10 million in any case.
Very approximate.
Yep.
Okay. Previously, Senator McGrath asked the previous witness too about the news agencies. 92% of people find they aren't necessarily the best place to go for information. Some turn to social media, which is arguably far less reliable than that 92%. Given you are the single party for truth or single source for truth for the election matters, do you consider anything that educates Australian people as to what they're involved in a vote as a wise investment?
Well, look, Senator, given what we're talking about, it's a fairly loaded question for the electoral
100%.
Administration body, to answer. I think that the previous witnesses from finance gave some advice on what government intends with this, and I'm not commenting on that. Clearly, people need to be aware of what they're voting on. Whatever method is used to inform them is a matter for Parliament and government, not for the AEC. And I would point out, just so for the record, with the yes-no booklet that has existed previously, the AEC's role in that was to act as a postbox. Okay. So both the yes and the no case came in, we packaged it up and then sent that out, but weren't involved in the development of the content of that material. So that was done by the parliamentarians who developed the yes and the no case. I'm happy to be corrected by that, but that's my absolute understanding. Obviously, I wasn't Commissioner when the last referendum occurred.
Now, and look, I'm aware, I'm trying to position a political point here, and I get that entirely, but you're such a... the AEC... the AEC... What we find is you are such a... and the AEC is such a strong independent defender of our processes and going forward. Our position as the only party, I think, saying we are not in favour of the voice going forward is that we are removing the public funding, we're removing the booklet, we're actually minimising debate around a very important question to a change in our constitution. Surely, as someone who has such pride in what they do to maintain democracy, that we would want to see, and you know, our position is we would want to see as much information going into Australians making a better choice in the absence of all of the public funding, all of the books, your guide, your household guide will get out there. Isn't it a concern that you put all this effort in to make democracy transparent and open?
That's an opinion, Senator, which I shall avoid answering at the moment. So.
I understand. And going back to the final couple of questions on scrutineers that Senator McGrath of previous stuff, how does the current scheme for appointing scrutineers and managing electoral workers happen now for a referendum?
Well, I guess very similar to a federal election. I mean, the electoral workers, we run that process entirely without the involvement of political parties or others. And we, as you know, Senator, we become, I think, Australia's third largest employer over a very brief period of time. In terms of scrutineers, with this particular act, I think political parties, Governor-General, Governor can all appoint scrutineers so that, again, people can have confidence in the process. Scrutineers are a critical part of any electoral event to make sure that citizens have confidence in the outcomes, and this is no different.
Is there any way a private citizen not part of the political process or knowing a political MP can be appointed a scrutineer to see this if they take an interest? So
referendum.
People from lands councils, people from other things that have an active interest.
Well, I'm presuming if those individuals, particularly from some of those large entities like land councils, I'm sure that they will be appointed by political parties or others in any case. As to private citizens, I might just take that on notice. I'm not sure about the...
Maybe a process to go through with the governor of the state or territory.
I'll take that on notice, Senator, and have a think about that one.
Okay, that's all I have, ma'am.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any further questions? Okay, thank you for your attendance here today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and we'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. And I'll suspend our public hearing until we resume at 12:30. Thank you. Public hearing. And I now call on Professor George Williams, Dr. Paul Kilday, Professor Anne Twomey and Dr. Gabrielle Appleby to give evidence. For the Hansard record, can you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Sure, it's George Williams here from the University of New South Wales. I appear in a personal capacity.
Thank you.
Anne Twomey, University of Sydney. I appear also in a personal capacity.
Thank you.
Paul Kilday, University of New South Wales, also appearing in a personal capacity.
Thank you.
And Gabrielle Appleby, also at the University of New South Wales. I'm the Director of the Judiciary Project at the Gilbert and Tobin Centre of Public Law. I've also been a member of the Indigenous Law Centre, working on the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Today, I'm appearing in my personal capacity.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Given we've got 4 of you on the screen, we might go straight to discussion rather than opening statements if you're all comfortable with that. Excellent, thank you. I'm interested in particularly your views on how a yes-no pamphlet has been used in previous referendums. We've had a lot of submissions looking at that particular part of this, this bill. So I'd be very interested to hear from your research and knowledge how that pamphlet has operated in past referendums, and also then what the consequences may or may not be of not having that pamphlet for this election, for this referendum. Professor Toomey, you're unmuted. Would you like to go first?
Sure. Okay, so for what it's worth, I've got my little folder here. This is all the yes-no cases that have ever been. So if anyone wants to ask me, I've got them all here. If you read them, are they informative? Well, sometimes, but often they are misleading. They are certainly emotive. They are certainly designed to persuade, but not necessarily to inform. Are they constructive in the process? Well, there's small amounts of usefulness in them. I think the most useful bit is the part at the end that actually tells you the words that are being changed in the Constitution, so people can see that. I think that's really important. But I've seen terrible things in both yes and no cases over time that have been incorrect or misleading or, really damaging to the process. So I wouldn't mourn the loss of the yes-no case, but I really would stress it is important that there be some kind of objective and authoritative information that people can access in making their decision. I also have a nagging concern that putting everything online will disadvantage some of our older voters who may not be as well across the use of online material as others and may still rely on written material and a pamphlet. So that's a small nagging concern there, but I think there is an issue about getting information to people who either don't have internet access for one reason or another or are not capable of using it. So we need better, access and equality of access there. But I also think there needs to be some kind of source of information that people can rely on. And it might be a matter of choosing a different way of doing it. So the example I gave in my submission was previously in New South Wales, instead of a yes-no case, a pamphlet was sent out that was written by public servants on an objective basis, and to make sure that it was objective and accurate, they did previously used to send it out to a range of experts in the field to vet it before it was sent out for approval. I looked at this once when I worked in the New South Wales Cabinet Office, and I had access to the files and I could read the file and I could see that process by which that was done. Unfortunately, I don't have that access anymore, so I don't have the files or the letters or the material. I remember reading, for example, a letter from Pat Lane, who was a professor of constitutional law at the University of Sydney, saying, you need to fix this or that. There are a number of people. So that was a way of doing it. I am not privy to what the Commonwealth Government is proposing to do when it says it's going to do a neutral education campaign instead. I hope it's good, but we just don't know. That's my 10 cents worth.
Thanks. Professor Williams, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with Anne. I mean, I've read those cases, and going back to 1912 when the procedure was put in, and it's clear that the pamphlet has not met Parliament's intent in setting it up. If you go back to why it was introduced in 1912, as I've got in the submission, the idea Parliament thought is that it would inject rationality into the debate. The Attorney General, William Hughes, said that he expected the cases would be put in an impersonal, reasonable and judicial way. And that has not happened. The pamphlets are often full of not only misleading statements, but sometimes lies that we know to be false. And very often they have done more harm than good. And they simply have not assisted, I think, in conducting the sort of referendum process we want. So I actually support the removal of the pamphlet, but I am troubled by the fact that I think merely removing it is not enough. We actually need to ask, how do we get the information to Australians so they can cast a rational, informed vote? so that they can make sense of the information before them. And what troubles me about this process is that we're getting rid of something that's doing harm, but we haven't got a proposal for what's going to replace it. And more broadly, I'd say on this, my larger concern with this process is that we've known for 20 years, of course, that these things were broken and problematic. This is the third referendum process in a row. We've had the proposal for an ad hoc jerry-rigged amendment to the referendum machinery legislation, and doing this is about as sensible as considering the electoral rules 6 months out from the next general election. There's a very good reason that your committee does this straight after the last election, because you should never be doing this on the eve of a campaign, but that's what we're forced to do, and that will limit our ability to put in place the right framework. And one thing I would urge on the committee is that it should adopt the practice after every referendum, just as it does for every election, of holding an inquiry into the prior referendum to look at the rules and put them in place for next time, so that we don't have what would be the fourth instance of looking at writing the rules just before we hold the poll.
I mean, just to get you to extend on that, but I mean, certainly we've had a decade under the previous government where these important issues weren't addressed, and we are now trying to address them in time for what will be a very important referendum. Looking at that time frame, then, are efforts to bring these laws into line with current, how the current rules are for federal elections and how they're conducted. Does that make sense in terms of giving voters the ability to understand a process, how they'll cast their vote, what that process will be like?
I think it's improved. I support the passage of this bill, but it's sort of the least worst what we can do in the circumstances. The political finance rules are picking up a lot of the flaws in the current legislation. There's no truth in advertising rule, even though we know it's probably even more needed for a referendum than a general election, given how misleading lies and statements are so effective and often the most potent weapon that campaigners would use. Yes, it was the prior government, but equally it was the Labor. I mean, we had the 2009 inquiry into this as well. It is a 20-year process. And I think as we look at spending over $100 million on a referendum, the community's got a right to ask, why are we yet again entering a referendum where the stakes are high? We need to have the right process in place. And yet for a couple of decades, successive parliaments have failed to put in place a proper modern set of rules. And this will be an improvement, but to be frank, it's a long way off what we should be doing.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kildare?
Yeah, just jumping off what George is saying there, I support a number of aspects of the bill, as I've said in my submission, but I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, does this bill put in place the best possible legal framework for a First Nations voice for a referendum in the next 12 months? Is it doing all that it can to ensure that the vote on First Nations voice is going to be fair and informed? And I think on what we have before us, the answer to that has to be no. So it makes a number of steps in the right direction, but it isn't doing all that it can. And I think the pamphlet is one area where that is the case. So it's hard to go into bat for the existing pamphlet. But if we look around the world, there are a lot of examples that we can draw on to have a really good pamphlet. So a pamphlet that has a clear explanation of what the proposal is, what legal effect it will have, to have perhaps arguments for and against presented, which aren't so hysterical, that are calmer and more measured. And even coming out of Oregon, say, the idea of a citizen statement appearing in an official pamphlet, which is generated by ordinary citizens engaged in a deliberative process. I think one of the things that we're up against is that we haven't held a referendum in over 20 years here, and best practice has moved on, and we're seeking to catch up. And I think going into the voice referendum, it shouldn't be a trial run for the next referendum, whether that's on the Republic or what have you. It shouldn't be the referendum where process mistakes are made and learnt from. It's really important that we put in place the best, most robust process that we can. And we are on the eve of the referendum. That makes it difficult to have these process discussions. But I think there is time. I think there's time if it's used well, and if the Parliament works cooperatively towards an improved bill.
Thank you. Dr. Akabuyi, did you want to contribute to that?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Look, I agree with the evaluations made by Professor Toomey and Professor Williams that the pamphlet has not achieved its objectives. But my concern with what we're seeing in the suspension of Section 11 in the proposed bill is that rather than thinking about reform, we're thinking about removal and suspension. And there have been not just learnings that we can take from overseas, as Dr. Kildea just indicated, but there's also been a lot of very reasonable, very productive reform proposals that have been put forward in the 2009 committee inquiry and again in the 2021 committee inquiry into referendum machinery. So there is a lot of material that's known about how to do this better, informed by comparative practice, of course, as Dr. Kildea just said. One of my concerns is that whilst I welcome the suspension of the prohibition on government spending during the referendum campaign in section 11.4, which opens up the possibility of more official information, we currently, under the bill, have no explanation about what that government information campaign is going to look like, and importantly, what the process behind that government information campaign will be. And my very strong view is that process behind the government information campaign, if they're not going to reinstate and reform the yes-no pamphlet, should be informed by all of those proposals as to how a good, robust, objective government information campaign should be run. It should include an explanation of the amendment, absolutely, but it should also provide an explanation of the yes-no case and also provide responses to information that's being put in the public campaign by other players in the referendum campaign. So there's an official source of information around what the arguments for and against are, an objective explanation of them, and then responses to what people might otherwise be reading in the course of the campaign. The process that the government should be following should be informed again by these recommendations that have been made in the previous inquiries. The establishment of an independent referendum panel to assist the government in this process, which can be comprised of constitutional experts. In the First Nations voice referendum, the First Nations representatives would be key in that panel, but also communication experts who could review the information that's provided by government. Just picking up on Dr. Kildea's statement, best practice across the world is moving towards an increased use of citizens' assemblies, and in particular, in relation to information about referendums, the use of citizen statements. Voters talking to voters about what's involved in the proposal and how to understand it and how to wade through all the information that's available. A form of mini public that is about how to understand the referendum. And just to pick up on Professor Toomey's point, I also strongly believe that the government information needs to be provided in hard copy as well as online for the reasons that Professor Toomey indicated. And I also would urge that it needs to be provided translated into other languages and also provided in a way that's accessible for the visually impaired. It needs to be able to be read and understood across Australians who need to perform this constitutional function. Thanks.
So I might just pick up on, I guess, a thread that you all had running through all of that, which was unlike the current yes-no campaign pamphlet, which in the past has been authorised by Parliament and, as Professor Williams said, has not really been that useful or informative. What you all commonly seem to be suggesting there is that this should be a process outside of parliamentarians. Would that be a correct characterisation of what you're saying in terms of that information being provided?
I think from my point of view, yes. And I think one thing I took from the second reading speech, but also commentary around this particular legislation, is that we no longer need to give parliaments the opportunity to communicate to the community through a pamphlet. And it made sense in 1912. The pamphlet was introduced prior to radio in Australia, let alone television, let alone internet and social media. So one of the main things for the pamphlet was just to let parliamentarians communicate to the people. We don't need it for that anymore. What we need it for is so that the people can receive information to enable them to cast an informed vote. So it's no longer just parliamentarians communicating. We should focus on the other side. What do people need to actually make sense of this and to feel confident going into the ballot box about how they wish to vote?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Back in 1912, if you read the debates, there's even a suggestion that perhaps just extracts from Hansard could be printed and sent out to voters, because that was the idea of, that people wouldn't otherwise be aware of what was being said in Parliament, and you needed to get the word out. So it's a long time ago. And it's a bit of a clash between representative democracy and direct democracy. In terms of what voters need at a referendum, they need good information, and probably it's best if parliamentarians aren't the ones in charge of providing that. And so good, objective, reliable, accurate information about the proposal and about the arguments for and against. And that's what's important. And parliamentarians need not be involved in that. And there are a number of examples we can point to around the world where that's the case. And I think that's why it's really important that an independent referendum panel be established. With a membership that is kind of agreed to by both sides of politics, and that includes, as Professor Appleby said, a range of different contributors, and to have them oversee the public education campaign. And I think that's kind of the best, that has the most potential in terms of providing effective but also trusted information for voters.
Yes, Professor Appleby.
Thanks. Yeah, look, I would just echo this idea that perhaps that the government information that's provided, which is sort of the official information that electors will look to when they're receiving information from many other mediums, of course, in the course of this campaign, should be provided by a group that's able to provide, as far as possible, objective, accurate, fair information about the proposal and about the arguments. I would just note that, of course, one of the benefits of establishing an independent review panel that I've spoken about as well as Dr. Kildea, is that it could perform a number of functions in the course of the referendum. It could be involved in the generation of the initial information, but it might also be able to be involved in sort of a fact-checking role as the referendum campaign continues. So if there is a need to provide further information about issues that have arisen in the course of the campaign, there is a possibility that the panel can provide that further information. It may also be able to perform a role in terms of determining how the question is set, which is another point that I addressed in my opening statement that I've provided to the committee. I apologise I provided it so late. But in terms of determining how to clearly, simply and accurately explain the referendum proposal in the course of a referendum question, an independent referendum panel could perform that function as well. So establishing such a panel has a number of useful purposes.
Professor Toomey.
Okay, just one last thing there. I wouldn't want this committee to think that this means wiping politicians out of the system. Of course, the really important aspect here will be the second reading debate, because the second reading debate, including the second reading speech, is the sort of material that may well be drawn on by the High Court in the future, and in terms of interpreting any amendment when looking at extrinsic materials and the like. So politicians, members of Parliament, will have a really important role in that debate. And of course, if you did have some kind of an independent review panel, it would inevitably draw on some of what was said in the second reading debate as a way of representing particular views or summarising them, etc. So I think it's not complete silos here. I think you would have, if you had some kind of objective material put out there, it would of course draw on the official political material that you'll see coming.
All right, thank you. Senator Cadell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll go through this a bit. I might have verbaled you, Professor Williams, earlier today. I'm going through the first three paragraphs in your submission on Commonwealth expenditure, particularly paragraph 3, removing of section 11/4, that if the intent not to take advantage of suspension of 11/4 is or its equivalent, if nothing else, the absence of such a clause means there is no capacity to hold the government to its commitment to fund, not to fund a yes or a no campaign. That's a concern for us, that a civic campaign that they're proposing can creep either way without fallback. Could you outline what your thoughts were on that? If we lose control of that without that Section 11.4?
I think that's a fair summary. Of course, what the bill does is just remove Section 11. It's suspended, but Section 11 is the clause that says you can't fund yes or no campaigns. So if it's removed, there's no longer anything to prevent the government from doing so. The government said it won't, but that's not really acceptable in this type of process. Parliament should have clarity about what the money will be used for, what the constraints are. And so what I say there is that it's just not acceptable merely to remove Section 11. We need to actually state with clarity what the government will be doing and what the guardrails will be. And if it is, there won't be a yes and no case. Well, we should retain that material while enabling the government to provide neutral information. So partly it's an accountability issue for me. The law should just reflect what the government says it will do, but also because, as we know, during referendums, things tend to get very heated. There's big disagreement about process. In 2013, the referendum fell over, in part because of disagreement about process and a sense there that the Gillard government, in allocating funding, was going against the intent of some of the people in Parliament. So I can see problems down the track itself for the referendum and the process, unless we're clear. But bottom line is it's just not a good way to do it. You shouldn't just suspend it. You should put in there what is going to happen so Parliament is aware of that.
Okay, thanks very much. Dr. Kildare, going back to I'll test your memory now, a 1918 document in December, the path to yes, where you're looking at referendum and writing there. You went through, and a quote from that was, "We should aim to build referendum processes that are participatory, deliberative, inclusive and fair." With the, and I get the problems with the pamphlet, but without any funding of a yes or no campaign, without a replacement for government information with that, do you think that a small-scale referenda is participatory, deliberative, inclusive and fair in the absence of a mature or otherwise debate around the issues?
Well, on the question of whether the funding should be made available to the yes and no sides, and here we're talking outside of the pamphlet.
Information, yep.
Information. Well, look, to be deliberative and fair, I think you do need to have good quality, reliable, accurate, balanced information, absolutely. And then the question is, how do you achieve that? And so that's part of what we're discussing today. And my views on that have been set out in my submission. And on the question of providing referendum public funding for the yes and no campaigns, that was of course done in 1999. I'm not sure that is essential for every issue. If you've got a proposal which has high profile, high salience in the public and reasonable amounts of private funding, which mean that the yes and the no arguments are going to be getting out into the public domain through different campaign groups, there may not be a need for the government to get involved to provide public funding. For very small scale technical issues, it may be necessary for that public funding. And so I think the simple absence of public funding for campaign groups won't necessarily affect the fairness or deliberative nature of a referendum, depending on the issue.
And going back to that article in general, in premise, I was taken by the fact that there's generally a fear of failure in Australia referenda, and that's not necessarily carried around the world. Where, parliamentary point, where we feel the steps to potentially make this a small target referenda going through, and that hasn't worked, 2013, where there was bipartisan support. Do you think we'd be in a better place with this individual if we didn't have fear of failure, where we could go more regularly to the electorate with ideas, maybe repetitively, and improve them, to see when the times change? Would Australia be a better place with more referenda?
Well, I think what has happened over the last several decades, not just since 1999, is that a bit of an attitude of defeatism has crept in with respect to referendums. And it is understandable why governments have decided not to hold so many, because the record isn't exactly encouraging. But the problem with that is that then we stop trying. And so I think we've now had the longest gap in our history without a referendum, despite there being pressing constitutional change issues to address. And so I think we would be in a better position if we were more open to holding them when there's a good case for a constitutional change to be put. And then rather than worrying too much about what the past record tells us, or worrying too much about what public opinion is necessarily going to be on an issue, to actually make for governments to make the case to the public and give the voters an opportunity to have their say. And I think that's what's happening here with the First Nations voice referendum. So that's in terms of my particular stance on that. I think that's a good thing. You make the case and then it's over to the voters. But there are other issues. So in general, yes, I think I think we could take a more positive, optimistic approach to referendums in this country.
Can I also add on that? And this was the view that the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Social Policy and Legal Affairs reached in December last year, exactly the point that has been made, that it's problematic when you come at a referendum, in this case every quarter of a century or so, not only because it's difficult to hold referendums when you're out of practice, but also because apart from the voice, there are many other things that should be fixed. There are often things that go to the federal structure, just bread and butter issues that actually might prove greater efficiency within government, save taxpayers' dollars. There's lots of things there that we should be looking at, and a more regular process would enable us not just to deal with the really big ticket important issues like the voice, but also the other really important things that just make government work efficiently and well for the community.
Thanks. Professor, I think I was going to go back to you there. I think Dr. Kadea, in his article back in 19, references a book you wrote with David Hume a fair bit, and you've gone to the 5 pillars of success, and they are bipartisanship, popular ownership, popular education, sound and sensible proposals, and a modern referendum process. Do we have the modern referendum process yet, or is that what we're talking about now?
Well, we've got the best process that they could think of in about 1912 for a number of key aspects. And we've got a good process for 1912, but radio and other things have happened since then, and there's a bit we could improve. And what we did in that book is we analysed all of the referendums that have been held in Australia, and we identified one of the key reasons for failure was problems with how referendums are being held. The process problems were a key issue, and that's why here this is so important, that if we don't get the process right, then it's quite possible the result, in fact very likely, the result will be affected by problems within that process, things like the yes-no pamphlet and other areas. It's not just having a level playing field, a proper process, a fair referendum. It's just the taxpayers' dollars too. I mean, the hundreds of millions of dollars we put into holding referendums based upon flawed rules is really concerning. Again, something that we have known about for decades, but it's a pity we're dealing with this now on the eve of the campaign starting.
Yes. Professor Toomey, we've heard about the absence of the pamphlet, and I'll just throw, you mightn't have been on earlier, the AEC did point that on their research about 40% of the population refers the primary source of material for them is their written brochure that goes out, so that's just for consideration. In the absence of a government yes-no campaign, a centralised, more information that we're talking about, a replacement for the brochure, does it open a lot more vacuum for dissenting voices from, far voices, from fringe voices to create noise?
Yeah, so this is something that I'm concerned about. I don't think that it should be left as a free-for-all on the internet. Just choose your different site to decide, to get the information you need to decide how to vote. I think that's unfortunate. People want some kind of authoritative place to go. So the police see what the actual provision, the change actually says, and some sort of objective analysis as to what it means. Now, I would imagine that the government is proposing in its public education campaign to have some kind of a source, maybe through some unimpeachable group, I don't know who it is, but having some kind of way of having an objective source to provide that to the public. But the problem is we just don't know that with this bill. All we know is that we're getting rid of the yes-no case. Okay, there is some justification in it because it's been used badly, but it would be worrying to get rid of it and not replace it with something better. The problem is the bill doesn't tell us what the better thing you're replacing it with is. So all we've got is, we're getting rid of one thing, but we really don't know what's replacing it, and that's a bit unsatisfactory. All we've got is those assurances in the explanatory memorandum and the second reading speech that there will be neutral public education and that everyone will be informed before they vote. Well, sounds good, but it's a hard thing to do as well. I mean, back to the 2013 local government referendum thing, I tried in the Constitutional Reform Unit at the University of Sydney. I had a go at doing an objective yes-no case. And I found it really, really hard, no matter how virtuous I was trying to be in providing that information, is actually really, really difficult. So whoever the government gets to do this is going to have a really difficult task. But at the moment, we don't know who it is and we don't know how good it's going to be. And if there's nothing at all, then you're right. If it's a free-for-all on the internet, you're just going to encourage more bizarre views out there being given some kind of level of legitimacy.
I think I saw Dr. Appleby, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Senator. I just wanted to add one point in one of the
Try again? No?
Sorry, Professor Appleby, we just lost you a bit there. We might come back to you. All right. No.
Okay. Can you hear me now, or the connection's not good enough?
No, we've got you back. Go ahead.
Wonderful. I was just going to add that I think a really important part of a government information campaign in relation to the types of views that the Senator and Professor Toomey were talking about, particularly those that are either intentionally or unintentionally peddling misinformation about this, about a referendum, is that the government needs to have an ongoing role in reviewing the information that is being put into the public domain as the referendum unfolds, and providing, what in shorthand we would call a fact-checking, authoritative response to some of the information that might come out as the campaign unfolds.
And can I agree with that? Because one of the big problems with the pamphlet is that it goes out once about 14 days before the poll. And, it's actually at the point often when people have made their minds up at that point, or they've turned off. In many cases, it doesn't actually do what Gabrielle has referred to. Ongoing is what is needed. That's what people expect. And on the Electoral Commission's statement of 40%, I mean, when I've looked at this in the past, yes, it may be 40% are aware of it, but I'd be shocked if more than 1% of the community had read it from beginning to end. I remember actually during the Republic referendum asking my class of constitutional law students, about 150 of them, not one said they had read it from beginning to end. It was such a turn-off. And in fact, many on the preamble took licence from Peter Andren's first argument in the no case for the preamble, and his first argument was, don't know, vote no. And they took great heart to that. They didn't know and they felt they didn't need to read any further. And that's one of the most common arguments you get, that ignorance is good enough for a no vote. So look, I just don't buy the fact that actually any reasonable percentage of the community actually engages with the pamphlet. It's not consistent with what I've seen.
Yes, Dr. Kildare.
Just coming just briefly on Professor Appleby's point about the potential for an ongoing role of an independent body, in particular in combating misinformation. And I know you've heard from the Electoral Commission this morning, but it does make me think about the very assertive role that the Electoral Commission has played in relation to misinformation about voting processes during elections, and just how effective that has been in kind of quickly clamping down on voting misinformation. And so there might be some lessons to learn there about a role for a body kind of clamping down on misinformation about the substance of a referendum proposal as well.
Senator Waters, over to you for questions.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks so much to the panel. I've really enjoyed your contributions so far. Can I just do a check? I think it was Professor Kildare and Dr. Appleby who proposed that there be some kind of independent referenda panel. And potentially also both of you supported a citizen's statement in some form of distributed pack of information, whether that be digital or whether that be a hard copy or a mixture of both. Can I just check whether Professors Toomey and Williams are also supportive of that concept of an objective, impartial, independently produced source of information?
Yes.
I think generally, yes, that's one way of doing it. I was closed-minded as to whether there could be other ways of doing it, and the government might have other proposals for doing it, but having some kind of an independent group to deal with these matters would be good. Again, I just am rather fearful as to how you do it, because I think it's really difficult when you get to substantive issues and arguments, and I have to say I don't really want to be the person doing it myself, so good luck to whoever ends up having to try and do that role. I think it is really hard, but yes, theoretically it would be a good idea.
And ideally, the committee would take evidence from overseas, from people who have done this work. I mean, referendums are held all the time around the world. There's great examples of what works and doesn't work. And really, you'd be advised to take evidence from those places to get a sense yourself as to how it has worked there or not.
Yes, it's not clear to me whether there will be some kind of impartial Professor Toomey, you've referred to a couple of extracts in the second reading speeches and the various explanatory materials, but I'm still unsure whether or not the government's referring to the AEC's household guide that merely goes to the process of voting as opposed to the content. So I think it's still a live question. Professor Williams raised an issue that I'd like to ask you all about, which is how you minimise the risk of misinformation, particularly given the fact that we don't, as yet, in our electoral laws, have a truth in political advertising provision. What are your suggestions as to whether we need that in place for this referendum? And do you have any thoughts on a different means of achieving that same objective, ensuring that misinformation or disinformation can be appropriately denounced?
Sure, Senator, I'm happy to have a first response to that question. I've been working with Professor Lisa Hill at the University of Adelaide, and I've written in the past about the need, particularly in relation to a referendum, and particularly in relation to a referendum on the First Nations voice, where we have such an important question being put to the Australian people, such a sensitive question being put to the Australian people, that we really should move prior to the referendum, and I do think there is time prior to the referendum to put in place a number of measures to combat exactly this issue, misinformation. Some of them we've discussed already today. An independent referendum panel, as I indicated, could have an ongoing role in responding to misinformation that is being provided in the public domain as part of the campaign. So there's sort of a fact-checking provision of further official information. But I also think that should be coupled with truth in political advertising laws that apply to referendums as well as to elections, which, as I understand, the independent member Zali Steggall's bill is proposed to apply to both forums. But I also think that part of combating the misinformation is the larger question that we've been spent a lot of time discussing today, which is the government information that's provided needs to be provided in accordance with a transparent process. The independent referendum panel being part of that, and how the experts are appointed to that panel. I've recommended that they be appointed by the Prime Minister in consultation with parliamentary leaders in the Parliament, and that they fit as I said, a set of different categories, including constitutional experts, First Nations representatives, and communications experts. So there is a level of confidence in the processes by which the government information is provided. But we also know from international experience, not just how that panel might go about its work, as Professor Williams just indicated. So, for example, in the UK, there is a process whereby a panel undertakes focus groups and checks how different ways in which different information is conveyed to voters is understood by voters before it's released as official information. So there's lots of international practices that a panel could review and learn from in its processes. But also this process of the Citizens Initiative Review and the creation of a citizen statement. The evidence from where it's used internationally is that voters take a lot of confidence from those deliberative processes whereby a representative sample of themselves, of voters, deliberates through a very transparent and a formal process, and then provides an explanation of the issue, of the arguments, of some of the trickier issues that the referendum raises. There is a lot of public trust in that information because of how it's generated, which is, to come back to your question, Senator, which is a really important way of combating misinformation, providing authoritative, trusted source of objective, accurate information. Thank you.
Thank you. That fills that out nicely. Professor Williams, I think you thought 14 days was far too short. And I think you also made the point that a static conveyance of information was not enough, that there needed to be some kind of, whether it's iterative or whether it's responsive to the various different pieces of information that might have come up during the course of the referendum. Do you have a view on the time frame? If 14 days is too short, what sort of time frame do you think would be optimal? And how do you envisage the sort of response style element of that information campaign?
Yeah, and it's not that 14 days is too long or too short. In some ways, it's just irrelevant. I mean, a one-off injection into the debate is not what is needed. As Gabrielle has said, I mean, it's already started, and I think as we know, social media will be weaponised for this in particular. It's already happening. This is the nation's first social media referendum. And we also know that many, if not most people, in making their minds up will be informed by social media as to how they should vote, much more so than newspapers, television and other forums in many cases. So we need something designed that actually targets misinformation and provides credible information according to where people will receive their information from, where they go to for that, and that more and more is social media. So for me, I mean, I think, yes, I do suggest a legal change picking up the South Australian measure. I think that's sensible, but I mean, I wouldn't kid myself to say it's going to actually deliver what we need. It's more about the other things that Paul and Gabrielle have talked about in particular. You've got your panel, you've got your ongoing engagement, you've got credible information critically going to social media channels, and that information is very responsive. You know, what's happening on the day? What are the arguments? So a good example for me was in the 99 referendum, where one of the arguments that really took traction at that point, particularly on Talkback Radio, was that if Australia became a republic, we could no longer compete in the Commonwealth Games. And, you know, that's very effective because people like winning all those gold medals. Completely wrong, because, of course, most of the Commonwealth now are republics. But how do you combat that? And that was on radio. How do you do that when something like that becomes a bit viral on social media? That's really the task. I think nothing to do with a 14-day pamphlet coming out just before the referendum.
Yeah, thank you. Very good points there. Dr. Appleby, I want to ask, and I understand you've been involved in the process of the creation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and I'm interested in whether you think the other aspects of that statement, namely truth and treaty, should be referenced in the civic campaign.
Yes, sorry, Senator, I was just finding my unmute button. Yeah, thanks for the question, Senator. I mean, one of the dimensions of the Uluru Statement is that it calls for a constitutionally enshrined First Nations voice that culminates in Makarrata, truth and agreement making. So it's a really important part of the call for recognition made by First Nations people in the Uluru Statement, that the voice is part of the structural reforms through which recognition of the place of First Nations people in the continent we now call Australia is. And I think that the placement of the voice in terms of the other reforms, and this has been written really well about by people such as Associate Professor Sana Nakata from the University of Melbourne, is absolutely part of understanding the First Nations voice and should be part of the education campaign around what people are being asked to vote on in the referendum.
Do any of the other academics have a view on that question, of whether or not treaty and truth should also form part of the education campaign? Is to be one. No? Okay, all right, well, I'll move on then. One final question. Just in relation to the timing of the bill, Professors Williams and Kildea both, I believe, told the House Committee that changes to the Referendum Act shouldn't be made on the eve of said referendum. Do you have any concerns about the timing of this bill, and how much lead time do you think should be allowed after its debate in Parliament before a referendum was to take?
Look, I think looking back, we've had a major inquiry in 2009. We set out a number of sensible recommendations, and then really nothing was done about it. It took a few years actually for a government response, and governments of both sides have chosen not to proceed with that. We've had the 2021 inquiry, of course. So it's understandable why governments don't move on referendum process changes when there's no referendum on the horizon, because it's not a priority and it's always a very crowded policy agenda. But really, I mean, ideally, these sorts of changes can be the subject of significant inquiries and public debate, and then legislated on, well ahead of a referendum. I couldn't put an exact time frame on it, but it's kind of like you want to patch your roof while the sun is shining. You don't want to wait till it starts raining, and that's kind of what we're doing here. Having said that, I do think that there is sufficient time. I mean, we see governments, including the current government, introduce some quite complex legislative change and have them implemented within a period of months. And so I think looking ahead to the voice referendum, although it is harder on the eve of a referendum, I think that there's still nonetheless scope for Parliament to work cooperatively towards it. I think just keeping in mind that trust is really important, and so then it needs to be some cooperative working together so that everyone, no matter what their view on the substance of the voice is, feels like the process is fair, and that whatever the result is, that they're going to be willing to accept it. So those things make it hard to make these process changes. Nonetheless, on things like public education and on referendum finance and question setting, the sorts of things we've discussed today, yes, the referendum is not far away, but I do still think there's time to work on those things ahead of the vote.
Just to add to that, something we do need to be careful about, and this was raised, I believe, earlier in the hearing today, and that is the obligations on third-party campaigners, both in relation to, making donations and what they're allowed to receive, what they're not allowed to receive, whether they need to, put particular wording of authorisation, how much they're allowed to spend. All of that stuff does have a lot of time issues related to it. I haven't gone backwards and worked out the level of time between now and when a referendum is held. You would need to have those things in place so that everybody knew in advance. But I think that does need to be taken into account, because people involved in the campaign need to be able to know when they are making expenditure and when they are making decisions, what the law is in relation to that, and then not be hit with it later on.
And there's a risk that some of that will end up being retrospective, given the timing's the 6-month period as well. And I mean, I agree with what's been said, and I suppose I'd say, as I went back to the beginning, I think I'd be keen for a recommendation that says after the referendum there is an inquiry to look at the referendum and the rules to put it in place for next time. Because otherwise we have the situation Paul has identified, that there's no referendum in the offing, and then there is one, and then suddenly we're in this process again. For the third time in 25 years on the eve of a referendum. I mean, I believe there is enough time to do what's needed. I agree with what's said. I'm confident of that. My issue is less that and more just the political risk increases. So, for example, with the pamphlet, it's harder to have this conversation now because it is, of course, coloured by yes and no cases wondering who'll be advantaged. So we now have to navigate a much higher level of political risk, and also recognise that it's quite likely that some people, either more likely will use the process in their arguments to say it's not fair, this has happened. And that's what happened in 2013, where the referendum machinery legislation became one of the key reasons the referendum was derailed, because bipartisanship broke down. So some of the more ambitious things might need to wait, and we just need to get something in place that has broad political support, and then look at it more deeply in a longer way after the referendum.
Thanks, Senator. Could I just...
Thanks so much, everyone, for your time and your expertise.
Thanks. Ms Cheney, you had some questions, I think.
Yes, thank you. My first question is on that truth in political advertising model. I'd be interested in the views of the witnesses today on who is best placed to administer those, to play that role and to administer any proposed truth in political advertising requirements.
Thank you. I'll take a first stab at that. Look, I think what you've identified there is just one of the really difficult questions in the design of truth in political advertising. of course, in South Australia, and their regime applies to both elections and referendums in that state, the Electoral Commissioner is responsible deciding, making determinations in relation to that. So one possibility is the Australian Electoral Commission if it was introduced, but it's well known that the Commission has a number of concerns about that, and I can understand that given the Commission is running the referendum, and so it doesn't want to be caught up in partisan or partisan debates about truth or otherwise. So there's a reputational risk for them. And I think in terms of answering that difficult question of who should be in charge, I think we do come back to this idea of a referendum body which is well designed and trusted, because then they, I think, would be as best placed as anybody, or perhaps best placed, to be able to be making determinations on whether particular statements are factual or misleading or not. Because we are talking about, I would assume, about statements of fact rather than statements of opinion, and that they have to be inaccurate and misleading to a material extent. So we're talking about a narrow class of statements, but in terms of someone who is at arm's length from both the running of the referendum and from the Parliament and the various campaigners on both sides, I think an independent referendum panel for me makes the most sense.
Yes, I agree with that. I think it's best not with the Electoral Commission for the reasons they give. And yes, a panel or other body would be ideal, but I would say if that's not feasible, as in South Australia, you could potentially put it with the Electoral Commission, but perhaps insulate it from the Commissioner. You might have an independent unit within the Electoral Commission. There are ways of doing this even within that structure to provide lower cost administrative efficiency, but make it clear that the Commissioner and those running the election are at arm's length from this unit within that body. Not ideal, but it would solve the problem in the short term.
Thank you. Another question is, should and could this bill make it possible to express the question, the referendum question, in simple terms within the constitutional constraints? So rather than referring to the long title and then saying, is this approved, actually putting the question up front. Is that something that's possible, and would it be recommended?
Yeah, thank you very much. I've addressed this in my statement to the committee. Section 25 of the Referendum Machinery Act and the schedule is what currently sets the referendum question by reference to the long title. And so it is feasible that an amendment could be included in the bill to amend this amendment in Section 25. Section 128 of the Constitution does require that the proposed law be approved by the voters. So there is still a requirement that the proposed law, generally understood to be the title of the Act, is put to the voters in the question. So there's a need to have a reference to the title of the amendment bill, but there is no reason why a short, clear, simple, direct statement about the nature of the proposal couldn't be part of the question, and then it could say, as contained in the short title of the bill. In my statement, I recommend, and this is informed again by international practice, that that question could be set by the independent referendum panel making a recommendation to the Parliament, a parliamentary committee, and once again, that it could be informed by processes such as focus groups, seeing how people understand different ways in which the proposal is stated, whether and to get the most objective and accurate and fair direct summary of the proposal for people in that question.
Sorry, thank you. Just broadly, I've heard the message that it's much better to review referendums afterwards rather than before. And some statements have been made that, there isn't enough time to prepare and modernise, prepare a modern and fair referendum process. I've heard that a big part of that is the provision of government information, but I'd love to hear what other things you think remain shortcomings or gaps once this, if this bill were to be adopted in its current form?
For me, one certainly is the question that Gabrielle's also referred to, and it's another thing that's loaded against holding a fair and transparent referendum. Simple to fix, and it's notable that the Prime Minister's question that he said at Garma could not be asked. And there are sensible things that can be done. The other big one for me is political finance. I mean, look, this is an improvement, yes, but the fact that we won't know who is funding the cases until only 6 months afterwards is a problem. You know, people should know that information beforehand. And the transparency regime is very, very weak. And I can understand why, because perhaps the political risk is too high to have a fight on political finance. But it really is a long way off community expectations now for what people would expect. And I'm sure this committee will have some sensible recommendations about that when you report for elections. But really, there's no good reason to hold a referendum according to a second-rate set of rules, except perhaps it's too late to do otherwise. But that's a big one for me, political finance, and we know how important that is to the community. And again, with a corruption body starting, that should be linking in to good political finance rules and the like. You know, that would be the enforcement regime, but you've got to have the Referendum Machinery Act in decent shape for that body to link into.
Yeah, I agree there with George and just say that I think what you really need to do is lower the disclosure threshold. It's way, way too high. And admittedly, this is preempting what you might do for elections, but hey, you could use this as a trial for that. And second, the introducing of the real-time disclosure methods. I mean, if you could do both those two discrete things as a trial in relation to referendums before going ahead with doing it in relation to elections, I think that would be a really useful thing.
I'll just jump in quickly and just to say that I agree on the need for changes to question setting and referendum finance. Like Professor Toomey, this is a real opportunity, I think, for the Parliament to put in place some more robust measures that could perhaps be adopted for elections generally. And these are measures that are used quite widely by the states. But yes, the disclosure threshold rate is too high and we should have real-time disclosure. The other issue with referendum finance is to consider the introduction of expenditure limits as exists, say, in the United Kingdom, because what the current bill doesn't do is deal with the potential kind of Clive Palmer problem, and it mightn't be Clive Palmer, but any kind of very wealthy individual or group who decides to spend a great deal of money on one side or the other, thereby undermining a level playing field. So it might not happen, but there's that vulnerability there, and there is practice around the world to learn from. And the final thing is just in relation to the possibility of voting day enrolment for this particular referendum to enable greater electoral participation, but particularly amongst First Nations peoples who have a disproportionately low enrolment rate.
Thank you. No further questions for me, Chair.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for your attendance here today and for submitting on such short notice. We appreciate it. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. I'll just ask members to stay on the line so that we can do some housekeeping, and I will thank all our witnesses for appearing at the public hearing today and close the public hearing.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you.